Chapter 1, The House of Death. What sinister secrets lurked behind the walls of ancient Egypt's most mysterious building, the House of Beautiful Becoming? The desert sun beat mercilessly upon the whitewashed walls of the Per Nefer as four men carried a linen-wrapped bundle through its narrow entrance. To the untrained eye, this structure on the outskirts of Thebes appeared unremarkable, just another mud brick building among thousands. But the faint, acrid smell of natron salt mixed with fragrant oils told a different story. This was no ordinary workshop. This was where the dead began their journey to immortality. Inside, the chief embalmer Per Nefer waited, his hands already ritually cleansed, his head freshly shaved as religious law demanded. He wore the jackal mask of Anubis, the god of mummification, transforming himself from mere mortal into divine intermediary. The body before him belonged to a minor nobleman named Userhat, dead 3 days from a crocodile attack while hunting along the Nile. Userhat's family had paid handsomely 70 deben of silver, equivalent to a farmer's entire lifetime earnings for the most elaborate mummification package available. Archaeological evidence from sites like Saqqara and the Valley of the Kings reveals that embalmers operated in these specialized workshops for over 3 millennia, from approximately 3,500 BCE until the practice declined around 400 CE. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in 450 BCE after visiting Egypt, documented 3 distinct levels of mummification service, much like modern funeral homes offered different packages. But Herodotus only scratched the surface of what truly occurred within these sacred walls. Per Nefer began the ritual with prayers to Anubis and Osiris, lord of the underworld. Ancient papyri recovered from burial sites show these weren't mere formalities. The embalmers genuinely believed that incorrect religious procedures could doom the deceased to eternal oblivion. The embalmer's liturgy, preserved in the Rhine papyrus, now housed in the British Museum, contained over 200 spells to be recited at specific moments during the 70-day process. The workshop itself was divided into distinct zones, each for different stages of preservation. Recent excavations at Abusir el-Melek in 2018 uncovered a remarkably intact embalming facility, revealing the sophisticated organization of these operations. The first chamber, where Userhat's body now lay, was the Ibu, the purification place. Here, the body would be washed with water from the sacred Nile mixed with natron solution. 2 junior embalmers, their apprenticeships already spanning 5 years, began the cleansing. They worked methodically, understanding that decomposition was racing against them. Egyptian heat accelerated putrefaction. Bodies began breaking down within hours of death. Modern forensic analysis confirms what ancient embalmers learned through trial and error. Bacteria in the intestines and organs cause bodies to bloat and rupture within 48 to 72 hours unless preservation begins immediately. The washing process took nearly 2 hours. Palm, wine, and water, both believed to have purifying properties, flowed over Userhat's crocodile-torn flesh. The embalmers worked carefully around the jagged wounds, knowing these would need special attention. Evidence from CT scans of mummies shows that embalmers often pack traumatic injuries with linen and resin to restore the body's shape for the afterlife. As Userhat's body underwent its first purification, his widow Nefertiti waited in an adjoining courtyard, forbidden from entering the Per Nefer itself. Egyptian society rigidly separated the living from these death rituals. Women could mourn dramatically at funerals. Tomb paintings show female mourners throwing dust on their heads and tearing their clothing, but the actual mummification remained exclusively male domain, performed by men who inherited the profession through family lines. Per Nefer examined the body carefully. His trained eye assessed the challenges ahead. Userhat had been a robust man of perhaps 40 years old by Egyptian standards, where average life expectancy hovered around 35. The crocodile had torn away part of his left shoulder and crushed several ribs. These injuries, while fatal, actually simplified one aspect of the process. They provided ready access to the chest cavity. But first would come the most delicate operation of all, one that still astonishes modern surgeons with its audacity and precision. Per Nefer motioned to his chief assistant, who brought forth a collection of bronze instruments gleaming in the lamplight. Among them was a long, slender hook with a slightly bent tip, not unlike a modern crochet needle, but far more sinister in purpose. The brain. Per Nefer announced to his assistants, beginning their daily lesson. Seat of mucus, according to our wisdom, useless in the afterlife, yet its removal demands utmost care. This moment, the extraction of the brain through the nose, represents one of ancient Egypt's most remarkable medical achievements. For centuries, scholars debated whether Egyptians truly performed this procedure or whether early accounts exaggerated. Then, in 2008, researchers using endoscopic cameras on mummies at the Cairo Museum confirmed the historical texts. Egyptians routinely removed brains through the nasal cavity, leaving the skull intact and the face unmarred. Pasherenaset tilted Userhat's head backward, supporting the neck with a wooden block. He inserted the bronze hook carefully into the left nostril, angling upward and slightly backward. The ethmoid bone, a thin, honeycomb-like structure separating the nasal cavity from the brain, offered little resistance. With practiced precision honed over 30 years, Pasherenaset punctured through it. Modern neurosurgeons examining this technique express both horror and admiration. Dr. Salima Ikram, Egyptologist and mummy specialist at the American University in Cairo, notes that this transnasal approach required intimate knowledge of skull anatomy. The embalmer had to navigate past critical structures, break through bone, and scramble the brain tissue without damaging the face or creating visible wounds. Pasherenaset rotated the hook, breaking up the brain matter. Ancient texts describe this process as stirring the brain until it liquefied. He worked methodically, spending nearly 30 minutes scrambling the tissue. His assistant stood ready with a collection vessel, a simple pottery bowl that would receive one of humanity's most complex organs, reduced to liquid waste. Once sufficiently liquefied, Pasherenaset tilted the head forward, allowing gravity to drain the brain matter through the nostrils. What didn't drain, he extracted with the hook or flushed out using palm wine and aromatic oils. Some embalmers, according to Herodotus, injected turpentine or cedar oil into the skull to dissolve remaining tissue. Chemical analysis of residues found in mummy skulls confirms the use of various organic solvents. The entire brain extraction took nearly an hour. When complete, Userhat's cranial cavity was empty, to be later filled with resin-soaked linen or left hollow. Interestingly, Egyptians never understood the brain's function. They considered the heart the center of intelligence, emotion, and soul, an error that persisted in Western medicine until the Renaissance. With the brain removed, Pasherenaset faced the second major procedure, evisceration. This would require an incision, and here Egyptian religious beliefs created a macabre ritual. The man who made the cut, called the ripper or slitter, was ritually cursed and chased from the workshop by other embalmers throwing stones. This wasn't personal animosity but religious theater. Egyptians believed the body must remain intact for the afterlife. The person who violated this sanctity, even for mummification's sacred purpose, became symbolically polluted. Yet this same slitter would return the next day to perform the same role, suggesting the curse was ceremonial rather than permanent exile. The slitter, a man named Amenhotep, entered the preparation chamber. He selected a sharp flint blade. Bronze wasn't used for the initial incision, as tradition demanded stone tools for sacred cuts, echoing prehistoric practices. Taking his position on Userhat's left side, Amenhotep located his landmark, a point approximately 4 fingers width above the hip bone, level with the lowest rib. In one swift motion, Amenhotep drew the blade downward, creating an incision approximately 4 inches long. The cut was deep, penetrating through skin, fat, and muscle into the abdominal cavity. Ancient mummies examined with modern technology show remarkable consistency in incision placement and length, suggesting standardized training across different workshops and time periods. Blood and fluid spilled onto the drainage table, a slightly tilted alabaster slab with channels carved to direct liquids into collection vessels. Nothing was wasted in the Per Nefer. Even these fluids would be ritually buried with the body, as they were considered part of the deceased's life essence. As tradition demanded, the other embalmers shouted curses and threw pebbles at Amenhotep, who fled through the workshop's rear door. Within minutes, he'd circle back and re-enter to assist with the actual evisceration. The entire ritualized chase took perhaps 5 minutes, a brief theatrical interlude in a process that would span more than 2 months. Pasherenaset now took center stage again. Through the incision Amenhotep had made, he would remove the organs that, if left in place, would rapidly putrefy and destroy the body from within. But unlike the brain, discarded as useless, these organs would be carefully preserved, for Egyptians believed the deceased would need them in the afterlife. The embalmer reached into the abdominal cavity, his hands guided by extensive anatomical knowledge. First came the stomach, slippery and distended. Pasher carefully cut the connective tissues and drew it out through the incision. An assistant immediately placed it in a bowl of natron solution. Next came the intestines, which required patience to extract without tearing. Pasher pulled out nearly 20 feet of bowel, coiling it like rope as it emerged. The liver followed the largest internal organ, dark and dense. Then the spleen, kidneys, and bladder. Each organ received immediate treatment in natron baths. The removal process took approximately 2 hours, during which Pasher worked with methodical calm, occasionally murmuring prayers. But one organ remained, the heart. Here, Pasher hand stopped. Unlike every other internal organ, the heart would stay within the body. Egyptian religious beliefs held that the heart contained the person's essence, their memories, personality, and moral character. In the afterlife, the heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth and justice. A heart heavy with sin would fail this test, condemning the soul to be devoured by Ammit, the demon who was part crocodile, part leopard, part hippopotamus. Ironically, given that Userhat died in a crocodile attack, his heart would face judgment by a creature containing crocodile essence. Pasher wondered if this held special significance, but kept such philosophical musings to himself. With the organs removed, the abdominal and chest cavities were now hollow chambers. Pasher-Neset's assistants brought jars of palm wine, which they poured into the body cavity through the incision. The wine served multiple purposes. It cleansed remaining blood and tissue, its alcohol content provided antibacterial properties, and its pleasant aroma masked the smell of death. They swirled the wine inside Userhat's body cavity, then drained it out, repeating the process 3 times. Next came a wash with aromatic spices dissolved in water, crushed cinnamon, myrrh, and cassia. Recent chemical analysis of mummy tissue using gas chromatography has detected these exact compounds, confirming ancient texts' accuracy. The spices weren't merely cosmetic. Many possess antimicrobial properties that modern science recognizes as genuinely inhibiting bacterial growth. The organs, meanwhile, received their own preservation treatment. Assistants had been working at separate tables, treating each organ individually. They cleaned each one in palm wine, packed them in dry natron salt, and placed them in temporary storage. Eventually, these organs would be placed in canopic jars, special vessels, protected by the 4 sons of Horus: Imsidi liver, Hapi lungs, Duamutif, and Kiba Sinuif, intestines. Each deity had specific protective powers, and getting the wrong organ in the wrong jar could have spiritual consequences. Interestingly, there was no canopic jar for the brain, since it had been discarded, and none for the heart, since it remained in the body. This 4-jar system remained standard for most of Egyptian history, though practices varied by period and region. With evisceration complete, the real preservation work could begin. Pasher supervised as workers completely covered Userhat's body inside and out with natron salt. This wasn't table salt sodium chloride, but a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate, mined from dried lake beds in Wadi Natrun, 60 miles northwest of Cairo. Natron was ancient Egypt's miracle substance. It desiccated tissue by drawing out moisture through osmosis, raised pH levels to inhibit bacterial growth, dissolved body fats, and hardened skin into leather-like texture. Scientific studies published in the Journal of Archaeological Science have replicated ancient mummification using natron, confirming that bodies can be completely desiccated in 35 to 40 days with this substance alone. Workers packed natron inside Userhat's emptied body cavity, filling every space. They heaped more natron over his exterior, creating a body-shaped mound of white crystals. Some was placed in linen bags positioned around the corpse. Loose natron filled the remaining space. In total, they used approximately 40 pounds of the salt mixture. The natron would remain for exactly 40 days, a number laden with religious significance in Egyptian culture. During this time, the body would lose approximately 75% of its weight as water evaporated from the tissue. What emerged would be dramatically changed, shrunken, darkened, hardened, but crucially preserved. As workers covered Userhat's body, Pasheri-Anaset reflected on the knowledge his profession had accumulated over millennia. Embalmers understood concepts that wouldn't be discovered by Western science for thousands of years. That bacteria caused decomposition, though they attributed it to evil spirits. That desiccation prevented decay, that certain aromatic compounds inhibited putrefaction, and that standardized procedures produced consistent results. They learned through countless failures. Earlier mummies from Egypt's pre-dynastic period, around 3500 BCE, show experimental techniques: bodies buried in desert sand, natural desiccation, wrapped in animal skins, insufficient preservation, or simply entombed without treatment, rapid decay. Each generation of embalmers refined techniques, building on predecessors' knowledge in an oral tradition passed from master to apprentice. Pasheri-Anaset's own training had begun at age 10 when his father, also chief embalmer of Thebes, first brought him to the Per Nefer. He'd started with simple tasks: grinding incense, preparing natron solutions, cleaning tools. By 15, he assisted with evisceration. At 20, he performed his first complete mummification under supervision. Now, at 43, he'd preserved over 500 bodies, from peasants to priests, from children to pharaohs. Each body taught new lessons. He learned that younger bodies desiccated faster than old ones, that obese bodies required extra natron and time, that traumatic injuries like Userhat's crocodile wounds needed special packing to maintain shape. He discovered that bodies brought in during Shamu harvest season, roughly March-July, dried faster than those treated during Akhet flood season, July-November, due to humidity differences. He'd found that certain aromatic oils preserved better than others, that some dyes stained skin more permanently, that particular grades of linen absorbed resins most effectively. This accumulated knowledge made him valuable and wealthy. The silver Userhat's family paid would support Pasheri-Anaset's household of 12 people for 6 months. It would pay his 5 assistants, purchase materials, maintain the workshop, and still leave surplus for his own eventual mummification. For like all embalmers, Pasheri-Anaset had already prepared his own tomb and funeral equipment, knowing intimately the importance of proper preparation for the afterlife. As darkness fell on this first day, workers covered the natron-buried body with linen sheets to protect it from insects and dust. The workshop would close until tomorrow, when other bodies awaited treatment. The Per Nefer never stayed empty for long. In a city of 50,000 people with an annual death rate of approximately 2%, 1,000 bodies needed mummification each year in Thebes alone. The embalmer's profession would never lack for work. Pasheri-Anaset removed his Anubis mask and washed his hands in a copper basin filled with natron solution. He recited the closing prayer, asking Anubis to guard Userhat's body through the night. Then he stepped out into the cooling desert evening, leaving the house of death behind until dawn. But Userhat's journey was only beginning. The next 40 days would transform him from deceased human into preserved vessel for his eternal soul. And after that, 30 more days of wrapping, anointing, and ritual would prepare him for burial and the afterlife. The question that haunted every Egyptian facing mortality echoed in Pasheri-Anaset's mind as he walked home beneath stars that had witnessed this sacred practice for 3,000 years. Would all this effort, all this expense, all these rituals truly grant Userhat eternal life? The embalmers believed absolutely. And in the perfected art they practiced daily, they saw their evidence bodies that would outlast empires, preserved faces that would gaze upon civilizations yet unborn. In the Per Nefer, death was not an end. It was a transformation, a beautiful becoming, a doorway to immortality. And the men who guided the deceased through that doorway were not mere craftsmen. They were artists, priests, and scientists, combined the guardians of humanity's oldest dream, to conquer death itself. Chapter 2. The 40 Days of Transformation. Can salt truly conquer death? Could something as simple as salt, the same substance used to preserve fish and flavor food, really prevent the natural decay that claims every living thing? Dawn broke over Thebes on the second day of Userhat's transformation. The Per Nefer came alive with activity as embalmers arrived to tend their various charges. Pasher-Neset entered through the workshop's eastern door, facing the rising sun as ritual demanded, and approached the natron-covered mound that had been Userhat. He didn't disturb the body. That would wait 39 more days. But he inspected the natron carefully, looking for signs of excessive moisture. The salt should remain relatively dry. If it became soggy or liquefied, it meant the body was releasing fluids faster than the natron could absorb them. In such cases, embalmers would replace the natron with fresh material to prevent incomplete desiccation. The science behind natron's preservative power would not be understood in modern terms for thousands of years, yet Egyptian embalmers had mastered its application through empirical observation. When body tissue contacts natron, several simultaneous processes occur. The sodium ions create a hypertonic environment, meaning the concentration of dissolved substances outside the cells exceeds the concentration inside. This osmotic gradient draws water out of cells through their membranes, much like how salting eggplant draws out bitter juices. As water leaves the cells, proteins within them denature and cross-link, creating rigid structures resistant to breakdown. The alkaline pH of natron, approximately 10 on the pH scale, creates a hostile environment for the bacteria and enzymes that normally decompose tissue. Most decay-causing organisms function optimally in neutral conditions, pH 6 to 8. The high pH essentially shuts down their metabolic processes. Additionally, natron dissolves fats through a process called saponification, essentially converting body fats into a crude soap. This might seem destructive, but it actually aided preservation by removing nutrients that bacteria would otherwise consume. The dissolved fats would later be replaced with aromatic resins and oils during the wrapping phase. Modern experimental archaeology has replicated natron mummification with remarkable accuracy. In 1994, Dr. Bob Breyer and Ronald Wade successfully mummified a human cadaver donated to science using only techniques and materials available to ancient Egyptians. Their subject, though kept in a temperature-controlled room rather than desert workshop, desiccated completely in 35 days. Chemical analysis showed tissue preservation comparable to ancient mummies, confirming that natron alone, without mysterious lost secrets or exotic chemicals, could achieve the results visible in museum collections worldwide. As Pasher-Neset inspected Userhat's natron covering, he noticed slight moisture at the lowest points where gravity had drawn fluids. This was expected and normal. The natron was doing its work. By day 5, most of the blood and internal fluids would have been absorbed. By day 10, the soft tissues would begin noticeably firming. By day 20, the body would have lost half its weight. By day 40, what remained would bear little resemblance to the robust man who'd hunted crocodiles along the Nile. While Userhat desiccated, Pasher-Neset turned his attention to the organs. Each had been sitting in its own natron bath for 2 days now. He examined the liver first, lifting it carefully from its salt bed. Already it had darkened and shrunk, moisture drawn from its surface. The liver, being dense and blood-rich, required the full 40 days to completely preserve. The stomach and intestines dried faster. Pasher-Neset checked them daily, knowing that over-desiccation could make them too brittle for handling. When properly preserved, the organ should be firm but not crumbling dry enough to prevent decay, but resilient enough to place in canopic jars without breaking apart. The lungs presented special challenges. Their spongy tissue trapped fluids in tiny air sacs, making complete desiccation difficult. Some embalmers removed the lungs through the chest cavity incision. Others left them in place, knowing they'd eventually dry into hard lumps. For Userhat, Pasher-Neset had removed them due to the crocodile's chest trauma, better to extract damaged lungs than risk incomplete preservation. These organs would eventually rest in canopic jars placed in Userhat's tomb. The jars themselves were already being prepared by craftsmen in the necropolis workshops. Carved from limestone and painted with protective spells, each jar would receive a specific organ guarded by a specific deity. The stoppers would be carved as the heads of the 4 sons of Horus: human-headed Imsti for the liver, baboon-headed Hapi for the lungs, jackal-headed Duamutef for the stomach, and falcon-headed Quibe Senuef for the intestines. This system wasn't arbitrary religious decoration. Each protective deity had mythological associations with the organ they guarded. Imsidi protected the liver, which Egyptians associated with courage and anger. Hapi guarded the lungs, organs of breath and life force. Duamutef watched over the stomach, center of sustenance. Kibe Senuif protected the intestines, which Egyptians believed might contain evil forces from improperly digested food. Interestingly, canopic jar practices evolved significantly across Egypt's 3,000-year mummification tradition. During the Old Kingdom 2000, 686 to 2181 BCE, organs were simply wrapped separately and placed near the body. The Middle Kingdom, 2055 to 1650 BCE, introduced the four-jar system with plain stoppers. The New Kingdom, 1550 to 1077 BCE, User Hat's era featured elaborately decorated jars with deity-headed stoppers. Later, during the Late Period, 664 to 332 BCE, embalmers sometimes returned desiccated organs to the body cavity or created dummy packages, while empty canopic jars were still included in tombs for symbolic purposes. These changes reflect evolving religious beliefs and economic pressures. Full mummification with separate canopic jars was expensive. As Egypt's economy fluctuated through periods of prosperity and decline, mummification practices adapted. When precious metals were scarce, elaborate gold leaf jars gave way to simpler pottery versions. When political instability disrupted trade routes, imported aromatic resins became scarce, forcing embalmers to substitute local materials. But during the 18th dynasty reign of Amenhotep III, approximately 1390 BCE, when User Hat lived and died, Egypt enjoyed unprecedented wealth and stability. The empire stretched from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north. Gold flowed from Nubian mines, tribute arrived from vassal states, and trade networks brought exotic goods from across the known world. This prosperity meant that even minor nobles like User Hat could afford top-quality mummification that would have bankrupted families in earlier or later periods. As days passed in the Per Nefer, Pashuri-Nasset monitored multiple bodies at different preservation stages. While User Hat spent his second day in Natron, another body, a woman named Mutnefert who died in childbirth, was on day 15. Pashuri-Nasset unwrapped the protective linen covering her natron mound to check progress. Mutnefert's transformation was dramatic. The natron had turned from pure white to grayish tan, stained by absorbed body fluids. Where her body contacted the salt, the skin had darkened to deep brown and taken on a leathery texture. Her facial features, once soft and full, had sunken as subcutaneous fat dissolved and moisture evaporated. Her eye sockets had collapsed inward, creating hollow voids. Her lips had retracted, revealing teeth in a death grimace that embalmers would later correct with padding. This was working exactly as intended. Pashuri-Nasset probed the tissue gently with a bronze rod. Firm, resilient, no softness indicating retained moisture. Excellent progress. Mutnefert would be ready for wrapping in 25 more days. The workshop housed 12 bodies at various stages. Pashuri-Nasset maintained meticulous records not written, as he was illiterate like most craftsmen, but memorized with precision developed through decades of practice. He knew each client's name, status, payment package, day of death, day of treatment, commencement, special requests from families, and particular challenges each body presented. One body, a young soldier named Nakht who died from infected wounds received in a Nubian border skirmish, had presented unexpected problems. The infection had caused extensive tissue damage in his left leg. Despite aggressive natron treatment, the damaged tissue hadn't desiccated properly. On day 23, Pashuri-Nasset had been forced to remove the affected leg entirely, amputating at mid-thigh. The severed leg received its own preservation treatment and would be wrapped separately, placed in Nakht's coffin so he would be complete in the afterlife. Such problem-solving distinguished master embalmers from journeymen. Mummification wasn't simply following rote procedures. It required adapting to each body's unique challenges. Obese individuals needed longer natron treatment and often required incisions on both sides to ensure complete desiccation. Bodies dead several days before treatment, perhaps from remote areas, arrived already partially decomposed, demanding special techniques. Victims of violence like User Hat with his crocodile wounds, or Knocked with battle injuries needed wound repair and strategic packing. Children presented their own difficulties. Their smaller bodies desiccated faster but were more fragile, easily damaged during handling. Infant mummification required extreme delicacy. Some embalmers specialized exclusively in children, developing techniques for preserving bodies sometimes no larger than dolls. Conversely, the largest bodies pose unique challenges. Pasheri Aset once mummified a merchant so obese that even after 40 days in natron, fat deposits remained incompletely desiccated. He'd extended the treatment to 60 days before achieving satisfactory results. The merchant's family had complained about the delay, but Pasheri Aset had remained firm. Rushing the process would result in putrefaction within the sealed tomb, condemning the merchant's soul to oblivion. The family relented. Around day 10 of User Hat's treatment, Pasheri Aset began seeing the characteristic signs of successful desiccation. The natron directly contacting the body had clumped together, saturated with absorbed moisture. This layer needed refreshing. 2 assistants carefully lifted the salt covering, revealing User Hat's transforming body for the first time since treatment began. The change was striking. User Hat had entered the Per Nefer, a robust man weighing approximately 170 pounds. Now he weighed perhaps 120 pounds, and that would drop further. His skin had darkened from natural tan to deep chocolate brown, not from decay, but from the chemical reactions between skin proteins and natron. His features had begun that characteristic mummy shrinkage. Sunken cheeks, prominent bones, collapsed eyes. Most importantly, he smelled not of putrefaction but of salt and faintly of the aromatic oils used during initial washing. This was the test that told Pasheri Aset the preservation was working. A body beginning to rot has an unmistakable stench that no amount of perfume can mask. User Hat smelled like leather and minerals, the scent of successful mummification. The assistants brushed away the old natron, which would not be discarded but rather sold at reduced price to lesser embalmers who reused natron for cheaper mummification packages. Fresh natron, pure white crystals from Wadi Natron, transported down the Nile in large pottery vessels, was poured over and around the body. Pasheri Aset personally checked that every crevice and fold was filled, that the body cavity was well packed, that no area was neglected. This natron refreshment happened twice during the 40-day period, once around day 10 and once around day 25. It ensured consistent desiccation and prevented the natron from becoming so saturated it couldn't absorb additional moisture. The organs in their separate natron baths received similar attention. Pasheri Aset rotated them regularly, ensuring all surfaces contacted fresh salt. The liver, being largest and densest, would remain in natron for the full 40 days. The lighter organs, stomach, intestines would be ready sooner, but were kept in natron anyway to ensure uniform treatment timing. By day 20, User Hat had lost approximately 60% of his body weight. He now weighed roughly 70 pounds less than a living child, though he'd been a full-grown man. This dramatic weight loss was almost entirely water. The human body is approximately 60% water. Removing most of it left primarily bone, dried tissue, and hardened skin. Pasheri Aset conducted a crucial test on day 25. Using a fine bronze probe, he carefully pierced User Hat's skin in an inconspicuous location, the back of the shoulder, and penetrated about an inch into the muscle tissue. He withdrew the probe and examined it closely, sniffing the tip. Dry, no moisture, no softness, no hint of decay. The tissue had the consistency of dried meat, firm and stable. This probe test was critical. If moisture remained deep in the tissues, it would eventually cause decay, even after burial. Pasheri Aset would rather extend natron treatment than entomb an incompletely preserved body. His professional reputation and his religious duty demanded perfection. On day 30, with just 10 days remaining, Pasheri Aset began preparing for the next phase. He ordered assistants to begin heating resins and oils that would be used during wrapping. He checked the linen shipment that had arrived from the Royal Linen Workshops, hundreds of feet of various grades, from coarse packing fabric to finest gauze for outer wrappings. He reviewed the amulets and protective charms that would be placed between linen layers, small faience scarabs, tiny golden wadjet eyes, carved images of protective deities. These preparations were crucial because once the body emerged from natron on day 40, work would proceed rapidly. The desiccated tissue was hygroscopic, meaning it would reabsorb moisture from the air. In Egypt's dry climate, this wasn't immediately catastrophic, but embalmers preferred to coat the body with moisture-resistant resins and wrap it in linen as quickly as possible to prevent any environmental moisture absorption. The 40-day period held deep religious significance beyond practical necessity. Egyptians associated 40 days with transformation and renewal. Some religious texts suggested that the deceased soul needed 40 days to complete certain spiritual transitions. Others linked it to astronomical observations. Certain stars and constellations followed 40-day cycles. Pragmatically, embalmers had learned through generations of experience that 40 days provided sufficient desiccation time for most bodies without being wasteful. Interestingly, this 40-day period appears in other cultural traditions. The biblical flood lasted 40 days. Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai. Jesus fasted 40 days in the wilderness. Whether these traditions influence each other or arose independently from observed natural cycles remains debated by scholars. On day 38, Per Nefer performed another probe test on user hat, perfect dryness. The body was ready, though he'd maintained the full 40-day standard. Reputation mattered in this profession. Clients expected exact adherence to traditional timing. Finally, on day 40, as the sun rose on what would be a momentous day, Per Nefer and his assistants prepared to unwrap user hat from his natron cocoon. The workshop filled with smoke from burning frankincense and myrrh, not just for pleasant aroma but as religious offerings to Anubis, thanking the god for successful preservation. The assistants carefully brushed away the natron, revealing the fully transformed body. User hat had lost approximately 75% of his body weight, now weighing barely 45 pounds less than a sack of grain. His skin was dark leather, his body shrunken but structurally intact. His face, though hollow-cheeked and sunken-eyed, remained recognizable. The crocodile wounds had dried and contracted into puckered scars. Most remarkably, he showed absolutely no signs of decomposition. No bloating, no discoloration from putrefaction, no skin slippage, no tissue breakdown. The natron had done its work perfectly. User hat was no longer a corpse in the normal sense. He was a preserved specimen that, if kept dry, would remain in this state indefinitely, not for decades or centuries, but for millennia. This was the moment when embalmers saw their success. Modern mummies in museums, bodies that have survived 3,000 years or more, prove that Egyptian preservation techniques genuinely worked. When archaeologists unwrap mummies, they often find tissue so well preserved that modern pathologists can diagnose ancient diseases, identify causes of death, determine diet through isotope analysis, and even extract DNA for genetic studies. Per Nefer allowed himself a moment of professional satisfaction. The transformation he'd overseen was nothing short of miraculous by ancient standards. Through knowledge passed down through generations, through careful application of natron and religious ritual, through 40 days of patient waiting, death itself had been halted. But the work was far from complete. A desiccated body wasn't yet a proper mummy. That would require 30 more days of intensive work: cleansing, anointing, packing, stuffing, painting, and wrapping. The transformation was successful, but the beautification making user hat presentable for eternity had only just begun. As workers gently lifted the featherlight body from its natron bed and carried it to the next chamber, the waybet, or place of purification, Per Nefer contemplated the question that had troubled him since youth. Did this elaborate process truly preserve the soul as well as the body? The priests insisted it did. The ancient texts promised it. The civilization's entire funerary industry depended on it. And yet, in his darkest moments, Per Nefer wondered. He'd preserved over 500 bodies, each treated with utmost care, each wrapped with proper spells, each buried with due ceremony. But not once had any of them returned to confirm the afterlife's existence. The embalmers worked on faith. Faith in traditions thousands of years old, faith in religious doctrines, faith that their meticulous efforts served purposes beyond mere preservation of dead tissue. He pushed the doubts aside. Belief was not his responsibility. Perfection was. And in that pursuit, in the transformation of mortal flesh into immortal vessel, he and his fellow embalmers had achieved mastery unmatched in the ancient world. The salt had conquered death. Now came the artistry that would transform preserved flesh into eternal beauty. Chapter 3. The Art of Restoration. How did they make death look like sleep? How could embalmers transform a dried, shrunken, hollow corpse, more resembling jerky than a human being, into something that looked peacefully asleep for eternity? The Wabet, or purification chamber, occupied the largest room in the Per Nefer. Here, after 40 days in natron, mummies underwent their final preparation before wrapping. Unlike the relatively simple preservation chamber where bodies desiccated under salt, the Wabet was a hive of specialized activity. Different stations handled different tasks: cleansing, oiling, packing, coloring, and cosmetic restoration. Userhat's dried body lay on a lion-headed embalming table, a specialized piece of furniture that appeared in Egyptian workshops around 3000 BCE and remained essentially unchanged for 3 millennia. The table was slightly tilted, with grooves carved to channel fluids into a collection basin. 4 legs carved as lion's paws supported the main platform, symbolizing the protective strength of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess. Modern museums possess several of these ancient embalming tables. The most famous, from the tomb of Amenhotep II in the Valley of the Kings, demonstrates the sophisticated woodworking skills of ancient craftsmen. Made from imported cedar wood, Egyptian sycamore was too soft for heavy use. Reinforced with bronze brackets and carved with protective spells, these tables were expensive professional equipment passed down through generations of embalmers. Pasherianasset surveyed Userhat's desiccated form with a critical eye. 40 days of natron treatment had preserved the body but left it looking decidedly inhuman. The cheeks had collapsed inward. The eyes were sunken black pits. The lips had retracted, creating a permanent grimace. The abdomen was hollow, concave. The extremities, fingers, toes, genitals had shriveled to almost childlike proportions. If buried in this condition, Userhat would technically be preserved forever, but he would not be restored to the whole, healthy form Egyptian religion demanded for the afterlife. The gods would question why his family had sent him to eternity looking like a dried fish. Worse, Userhat's BA, his personality, soul might not recognize this shrunken form as its proper home and fail to reunite with it, dooming him to eternal wandering. Thus began the restoration phase, a combination of practical reconstruction and artistic beautification that would occupy the next 10 days before wrapping commenced. First came cleansing. Though the natron had desiccated the body, it left behind salt crystals and residue that needed removal. Assistants brought jars of warm water mixed with natron solution, yes, more natron, but this time in dilute liquid form rather than concentrated crystals. Using soft cloths made from worn-out linen, they gently washed Userhat's entire body surface. This washing served multiple purposes. It removed salt residue that might otherwise create a white crust on the skin. It slightly rehydrated the outermost skin layer, making it more pliable for later manipulation. It began the ritual purification that would be repeated multiple times before burial. Egyptians believed that water, especially Nile water, carried spiritual cleansing properties. After water cleansing came oil treatment. This was not the final anointing that would occur during wrapping, but rather a practical conditioning process. Pasherianasset himself mixed the oil blend. Palm oil as the base, mixed with cassia oil for scent, cedar oil for preservation properties, and a small amount of myrrh resin dissolved in the mixture. Modern analysis of mummy tissue confirms the presence of these exact substances. Gas chromatography mass spectrometry, GCMS, performed on tissue samples from mummies of this period consistently shows chemical signatures of palm oil, cedar oil, cassia, myrrh, frankincense, and other aromatic compounds. The ancient texts accurately describe the materials used. Assistants rubbed the oil mixture over every inch of Userhat's skin, working it in with practiced motions. The dried tissue absorbed the oil slowly, darkening further and taking on a slight sheen. This oil treatment wasn't merely cosmetic. It created a barrier against moisture reabsorption and added a pleasant scent that would last for centuries. When archaeologists open sealed tombs, they often report the smell of ancient resins and oils, still fragrant after 3,000 years. With the skin conditioned, Pasherianasset turned to the most delicate aspect of restoration, recreating lifelike facial features. This work required the skills of a sculptor combined with the anatomical knowledge of a physician. He began with the eyes. The empty eye sockets created a ghastly, skull-like appearance that needed correction. Pasher selected 2 small pads of linen cloth, each about the size of a grape. These he packed with a mixture of sawdust and resin to create firm but slightly yielding spheres. He inserted one into each eye socket, pressing it backward until it sat where the eyeball had once been. This wasn't sufficient by itself. The linen balls didn't fill the socket completely. Pasher added additional packing around each sphere using smaller cloth pieces soaked in resin. He worked carefully, building up the packing until each eye socket was filled to the same level as the surrounding bone structure. Next came the delicate work of reconstructing the eyelids. The desiccated lids had shriveled and retracted. Using fine bronze spatulas and wooden tools, Pasher gently manipulated the dried skin, folding it over the packed eye sockets. Where the skin was too dry and stiff, he applied additional warm oil to increase pliability. Slowly, with patience developed over decades, he positioned each eyelid to create the appearance of peacefully closed eyes. Some embalmers went further, painting eyes onto the closed lids using dark ink or even placing artificial eyes, made from stone or glass, under the lids. But Pasher preferred the subtler approach of simple closed eyes, which gave a more natural sleeping appearance. The mouth required similar attention. The retracted lips revealed teeth and an undignified grimace. Pasher had 2 options: push the lips closed over the teeth, or pack the mouth area to support the lips from within. He chose the latter approach. Using fine cloth soaked in resin, he packed Userhat's mouth cavity, not the entire mouth, which would create an unnaturally puffy appearance, but just the space between teeth and lips. This slight padding pushed the lips forward into a more natural position. He then manipulated the dried lip tissue with oiled tools, pressing the upper and lower lips together to create a closed, neutral expression. The nostrils, collapsed from the brain removal process, also needed attention. Pasher inserted small rolls of linen into each nostril, giving them shape and dimension. Too much packing would create a pig-like snout. Too little would leave the nose collapsed. The embalmer's skill showed in getting this balance exactly right. The cheeks presented the greatest challenge. Desiccation had caused the facial fat and muscle to completely collapse, leaving Userhat with the sunken-cheeked appearance of extreme starvation. This looked particularly unnatural for a man who had been well-fed in life. To address this, Pasher made 2 small incisions inside Userhat's mouth, cutting through the dried cheek tissue from the interior where the cuts wouldn't be visible. Through these incisions, he inserted packing material, a mixture of sawdust, linen scraps, and resin paste. He worked the packing carefully through the mouth incisions, distributing it evenly across the cheek area to recreate the natural facial contours. This subcutaneous packing technique required extraordinary skill. Too much packing created a bloated, unnatural appearance. Too little left the face sunken. The packing had to be distributed evenly to avoid lumps or asymmetry, and the embalmers worked with dried tissue they couldn't see through, using touch alone to gauge the results. X-rays and CT scans of mummies from this period frequently show this subcutaneous packing in the face, neck, and sometimes other body areas. Modern forensic anthropologists marvel at the skill required to perform this work using only simple bronze tools, working by feel, achieving results that often look remarkably lifelike even after 3 millennia. With the face restored, Pasher turned to the body cavity. The removal of organs had left the torso completely hollow. Chest and abdomen were empty shells. If left unfilled, the body would collapse further over time, and the concave abdomen looked unnatural. The filling of body cavities evolved throughout Egyptian history. During the Old Kingdom, embalmers simply packed the abdomen with linen soaked in resin. By the Middle Kingdom, they added sawdust to create bulk. By the New Kingdom Userhat's era, the process had become quite sophisticated. Pasher directed assistants to prepare the cavity packing mixture. They combined sawdust from expensive imported cedar wood, praised for its aromatic properties and resistance to insects, crushed myrrh resin, small amounts of natron powder, and dried lichen, which added bulk and had mild antibacterial properties. This mixture was slightly moistened with liquid resin to help it hold together. The assistants packed this mixture into Userhat's abdominal cavity through the original evisceration incision. They worked methodically, filling the pelvis first, then the lower abdomen, then the upper abdomen. Pashery and Aset supervised closely, pressing on the exterior abdomen to gauge the filling. The goal was to restore the natural body contour flat or slightly rounded abdomen, depending on what the deceased looked like in life. For the chest cavity, which had its own special significance as the home of the preserved heart, Pashery and Aset used finer material, pure linen scraps, soaked in liquid myrrh resin. This wrapped around and cushioned Userhat's dried heart, still in place as religious law demanded. The chest was packed less full than the abdomen, maintaining the natural structure of the ribcage. Some high-status mummies received extraordinary cavity treatments. Royal mummies sometimes had their abdomens filled with packets of natron wrapped in linen, sawdust mixed with precious spices, or even small figurines of protective deities. Tutankhamun's mummy contained multiple amulets placed inside the body cavity before packing, discovered only when Howard Carter unwrapped the mummy in the 1922nd. With the torso repacked, Pashery and Aset addressed another delicate matter, the genitals. Desiccation had drastically shrunk these tissues, which created both cosmetic and religious problems. Egyptian afterlife beliefs required the deceased to be sexually functional tomb paintings, showed the deceased enjoying feasts, entertainments, and conjugal pleasures in the eternal paradise. For male mummies, embalmers sometimes attached artificial phalluses made from wood or wrapped linen, or they padded the dried original tissues with resin-soaked cloth to restore natural dimensions. Pashery and Aset chose the latter approach for Userhat, carefully wrapping and padding the shrunken genitals until they appeared normally proportioned. Female mummies received similar attention, though the techniques differed. Some embalmers packed the vaginal opening with resin-soaked linen. Others simply arranged the legs to maintain modesty. Pregnant women who died before childbirth sometimes had their fetuses mummified separately and placed in the coffin. The extremities, hands, and feet also required work. Fingers and toes had shriveled to almost skeletal thinness. Pashery and Aset wrapped each digit individually with thin strips of linen soaked in resin, building up layers until each finger and toe appeared normally proportioned. This painstaking work took hours, but the result was hands that looked like hands, feet that looked like feet, rather than dried twigs. CT scans of well-prepared mummies show this individual finger and toe wrapping, sometimes with small amulets placed on specific digits. The care lavished on even these small details demonstrates the religious importance of bodily completeness. The crocodile wounds on Userhat's shoulder and chest had dried into puckered scars that needed cosmetic attention. Pashery and Aset filled the torn areas with resin paste mixed with linen fibers, creating a smooth surface. Once wrapped, these repairs would be invisible, presenting Userhat to eternity as whole and unmarred. On the third day in the Wabbit, attention turned to cosmetic enhancement. This went beyond restoration to actual beautification, making the deceased look their best for eternity. Here, embalming crossed from medical procedure into artistic expression. Assistants prepared cosmetic materials: red ochre powder for coloring cheeks and lips, black coal for eyes, yellow ochre for overall skin toning. These weren't applied as heavily as makeup on a living person. The goal was subtle enhancement, not theatrical effect. For male mummies, like Userhat, the cosmetic treatment was relatively minimal. A slight darkening around the eye areas to define them, a faint reddish tone to the lips suggesting vitality rather than death. Female mummies typically received more elaborate cosmetic enhancement, pronounced eye definition, ruddier cheeks, sometimes even nail coloring with henna. Pashery and Aset personally applied Userhat's cosmetics using fine brushes made from palm fiber, a touch of ochre along the cheekbones, a subtle darkening of the lip line, a slight emphasis around the eyes. The effect was understated, but effective Userhat's face took on a more lifelike quality, looking less like dried leather and more like tanned skin. Some elite mummies received even more elaborate cosmetic treatments. False braids or wigs were attached to bald heads. Gold foil was applied to fingernails and toenails. Artificial eyebrows made from human hair were glued in place. Royal mummies sometimes had their skin gilded with actual gold leaf, transforming them into divine golden statues. The most extreme example known is Tutankhamun's mummy, which was so heavily treated with resins and unguents that it essentially carbonized, fusing to the coffin. When Howard Carter tried to remove the mummy, he had to chisel it out, causing significant damage. The pharaoh had been given such elaborate treatment that it actually harmed long-term preservation, an ironic outcome of excessive religious devotion. On the fifth day in the Wabet, Pasheri and Aset supervised the final preparatory step before wrapping, the overall resin coating. This would create a moisture barrier and add a final layer of preservation to the already desiccated tissue. Assistants heated large quantities of resin in copper cauldrons over fires outside the workshop. The resin pine resin imported from Lebanon, prized for its superior preservation qualities, melted into a thick, dark liquid with a strong piney scent. They added small amounts of aromatic oils to enhance the fragrance and improve flow properties. When the resin reached proper consistency, thick enough to coat but thin enough to brush, assistants brought the cauldrons into the wabet. Working quickly before the resin cooled and thickened, they painted it over user hat's entire body surface using wide brushes made from palm fronds. The hot resin was applied in multiple thin coats rather than one thick layer. This prevented runs and drips while ensuring complete coverage. Between coats, the resin was allowed to cool and harden slightly, creating a multi-layered protection system. The resin coating served several crucial functions. It created a waterproof barrier preventing moisture reabsorption. Its antimicrobial properties, pine resin contains compounds toxic to bacteria and fungi, added extra preservation insurance. It filled microscopic cracks in the dried skin, creating a smoother surface for wrapping, and it gave the mummy a pleasant, long-lasting aroma. Chemical analysis of mummy resin coatings reveals sophisticated mixtures. In addition to pine resin, embalmers used pistacia resin, frankincense, myrrh, beeswax to improve flow and adhesion, and various plant oils. The exact formulations varied by period, region, and economic status of the client. Royal mummies received the most expensive imported resins. Commoners might get local tree saps or even bitumen, natural petroleum asphalt as cheaper substitutes. Interestingly, the word mummy itself derives from the Arabic word mumia, meaning bitumen. Medieval Arab scholars observed dark-colored preserved bodies in Egyptian tombs and assumed they'd been treated with bitumen black petroleum-based substance used for waterproofing. While some later period mummies were indeed treated with bitumen as expensive resins became scarce, most high-quality mummies like Userhat used imported tree resins. The misnomer stuck, and mummy entered world languages. As the final resin coat dried on Userhat's body, turning his skin a deep, glossy brown, Pasheri Neset stepped back to evaluate the work. The transformation was complete. What had entered the Per Nefer 70 days ago as a crocodile-mauled corpse and emerged from natron 40 days ago as a shriveled, dried husk, now appeared as a complete human form with recognizable features, appropriate proportions, and lifelike appearance. Well, lifelike was perhaps overstating. Userhat clearly looked deceased, but he looked peacefully deceased, sleeping rather than suffering, whole rather than damaged, preserved rather than decaying. He looked, in short, ready for eternity. But he still wasn't finished. The most elaborate and ritualized portion of mummification remained: the wrapping. This would take another 20 to 25 days of intensive work, during which Userhat would be transformed from a prepared body into a sacred bundle, protected by hundreds of feet of linen and dozens of amulets, made into a vessel worthy of receiving his Ka, life force, and Ba, personality, back from the gods. As Pasheri Neset cleaned his tools and dismissed his assistants for the day, he reflected on the artistry his profession had achieved. Embalmers weren't mentioned in the same breath as sculptors or painters, yet their work demanded equal artistic skill combined with technical knowledge those artists never needed. A sculptor who made a mistake could chisel away stone and start over. An embalmer working on human tissue got no second chances. Once flesh was cut, packed, or manipulated, the work was permanent. Errors couldn't be undone. There was no practice material. Every body was a unique individual requiring custom solutions. And unlike sculptors whose work would be displayed and admired, embalmers' finest efforts were hidden beneath layers of linen, sealed in coffins and buried in tombs. Only the gods would see their craftsmanship. Only the deceased would benefit from their skill. Only their professional pride and religious conviction rewarded their efforts. Yet this didn't diminish the work's importance. If anything, it elevated it. Creating beauty for public display served earthly vanity. Creating perfection that only gods would witness served eternal truth. Tomorrow, the wrapping would begin, and with it, User Hat would enter the final transformation, from preserved body to sacred mummy, from mortal remains to immortal vessel, from death to eternal life. The art of restoration had answered its question. Death had been made to look like sleep, peaceful, whole, and ready for awakening in the paradise that awaited beyond the western horizon, where Ra descended each night to begin his journey through the underworld, where Osiris ruled his kingdom of eternal plenty, where User Hat would soon take his place among the blessed dead. If the embalmers had done their work properly, if the priest performed the opening of the mouth ceremony correctly, if User Hat's heart proved pure when weighed against Ma'at's feather, if the gods accepted him, so many ifs, but Pasherianeset had controlled what he could control, the physical preservation. The rest was in the hands of fate, the gods, and User Hat's own soul. Chapter 4. Layers of Eternity. Why did they use miles of linen? Why would embalmers wrap a single body in enough linen fabric to clothe an entire village, sometimes using over 1,000 linear feet of cloth that took teams of weavers months to produce? The wrapping chamber, the final section of the Per Nefer, was the largest and most meticulously organized space in the entire workshop. Racks lined the walls, holding linen strips of varying widths, each sorted by quality and purpose. Shelves displayed hundreds of amulets, protective charms, and sacred objects that would be placed between the wrapping layers. Tables held bowls of liquid resins, pots of molten wax, jars of fragrant oils, and ritual implements inscribed with protective spells. This chamber was less a workshop than a temple. The wrapping process wasn't just practical protection of the preserved body, it was an intensely religious ritual where every layer, every knot, every amulet placement carried spiritual significance. Get the wrapping wrong, and all the previous preservation work became meaningless. The deceased might be physically preserved, but spiritually vulnerable, unable to complete the journey to the afterlife. User Hat's resin-coated body lay on a fresh embalming table, positioned precisely east-west, with the head facing east toward the rising sun, symbol of daily rebirth, promise of resurrection. Pasherianeset had spent the previous day in ritual purification, bathing, shaving his entire body, fasting, and sleeping in the Per Nefer itself to avoid any polluting contact with the outside world. Today marked the 71st day since User Hat's death, the first day of wrapping. According to tradition, the complete wrapping process should take 15 days minimum, though high-status mummies might undergo 25 or even 30 days of elaborate wrapping. User Hat's family had paid for the 20-day wrapping service, indicating their serious commitment to his eternal welfare. Before the first strip of linen touched User Hat's body, Pasherianeset performed the ritual invocations. He wore his ceremonial Anubis mask, not the simple jackal face used during evisceration, but an elaborate version covered with gold leaf, with eyes of black obsidian and teeth of carved ivory. In this mask, he became the god, not merely the god's servant. Anubis, lord of the sacred land, guide of the dead, master of embalming. Pasherianeset intoned, his voice muffled but amplified by the mask's structure. Extend your protection over User Hat, noble servant of Pharaoh, hunter of the Nile, beloved of his family. Guard his journey to the west. Ensure his rebirth in the field of reeds. Let no evil spirit disturb his rest. Let no demon steal his breath. Let no chaos creature consume his heart. The prayer continued for nearly 30 minutes, naming dozens of protective deities and invoking specific protection against specific dangers. These weren't empty words. Egyptians genuinely believed that the journey to the afterlife was fraught with actual dangers. Demons who might devour souls, obstacles that could trap the unwary, challenges requiring correct knowledge to overcome. The Book of the Dead, actually a collection of spells properly called the Book of Coming Forth by Day, described these afterlife challenges in detail. The deceased needed to know the names of gatekeepers to pass through 12 gates. They needed spells to transform into various animals to escape dangers. They needed passwords and counterspells. The wrapping process incorporated many of these protective elements directly into the mummy's structure. With prayers complete, Pasherianeset selected the first linen strip. This was no ordinary cloth. The linen came from royal workshops that supplied the finest fabric in Egypt, woven so finely that thread counts reached 200 threads per inch, comparable to modern high-quality bedsheets. Some royal linens were even finer, reaching 500 threads per inch, creating fabric nearly transparent in its delicacy. Egyptian linen production was sophisticated enough that modern weavers struggled to replicate ancient techniques. Flax cultivation required extensive knowledge of planting cycles, harvesting timing, and processing methods. The fibers needed precise retting, controlled decomposition to separate fibers from woody stems, careful hackling combing to align fibers, and skilled spinning on weighted spindles. Weaving occurred on horizontal ground looms that produced long, narrow strips of fabric, exactly what mummy wrapping required. The economic scale of mummy wrapping was staggering. A fully wrapped elite mummy might contain 375 to 450 square yards of linen, enough to make a dozen full-sized bedsheets. At ancient prices, this much fine linen represented several months' wages for a skilled craftsman. For royal mummies, the linen alone cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Where did all this linen come from? Multiple sources. New fabric purchased specifically for the burial, household linens belonging to the deceased clothing, bed sheets, towels, donated cloth from family members, and recycled linen from temple inventories. Archaeologists unrolling mummies have found linen strips with laundry marks, dyer's stamps, and even personal names written in ink. These pieces were once someone's tunic or a temple altar cloth, repurposed for eternity. Pascherine began with the fingers and toes, the extremities that needed protection and individual definition. Using strips about 1 inch wide and several feet long, he wrapped each digit separately, spiraling the linen from base to tip and back again. Each finger received its own wrapping, carefully maintaining the separation between digits so the hand didn't become a mitten blob. This individual finger and toe wrapping wasn't universally practiced. Cheaper mummification packages wrapped the hands and feet as units. But for quality mummies, separate digit wrapping was standard. It maintained the body's integrity, prevented fingers from breaking off during transport and burial, and ensured the deceased had functioning hands in the afterlife. As Pascherine wrapped each toe, he recited specific spells. Spell for making firm the toes of Userhat was chanted over the feet. These weren't just empty ritual. The spells came from ancient religious texts, some dating back 1,000 years before Userhat's time, preserved and transmitted through generations of embalmers and priests. The individual finger wrapping took most of the first day. By evening, Userhat's hands and feet were encased in neat linen wrappings, each digit clearly defined but protected. Tomorrow would bring the limb wrappings. Day 2 began with the arms. Pascherine used wider linen strips 3 to 4 inches wide, spiraling them up each arm from wrist to shoulder. The wrapping wasn't random. It follows specific patterns documented in the embalmer's manual. The cloth spiraled in one direction up the arm, then reverse direction coming back down, creating a cross-hatched pattern that distributed stress evenly and prevented the wrapping from unraveling. Between layers, Pascherine applied liquid resin with a brush, creating adhesion between fabric layers. This resin application served multiple purposes. It glued the layers together so they couldn't unwrap. It filled gaps in the weave, creating airtight barriers. It added extra preservation insurance, and it created a rigid structure that maintained body shape. The legs received similar treatment, though with additional reinforcement. Leg wrappings sometimes incorporated thin wooden splints or reed bundles to prevent the brittle bones from snapping during transport to the tomb. For Userhat, Pascherine placed palm wood splints along the shin bones, wrapping them securely into the linen layers. By day 3, the limbs were completely wrapped, transformed into neat linen-covered cylinders. Now came one of the most important aspects of wrapping: amulet placement. Amulets weren't decorative jewelry, they were powerful magical objects, each with specific protective functions. The types, numbers, and placement of amulets followed strict religious guidelines. The Book of the Dead specified which amulets went where, and making errors could leave the deceased vulnerable to specific dangers. Pascherine had prepared dozens of amulets over the preceding weeks. Some he'd carved himself from semi-precious stones, jasper, carnelian, lapis lazuli. Others he'd purchased from specialized amulet makers. Each was inscribed with protective spells in hieroglyphics, so tiny they required magnification to read clearly. The first amulet placed was the heart scarab, perhaps the most crucial of all protective objects. This large scarab beetle carved from green stone, typically basalt or schist, would be placed directly over user hat's heart. The scarab's flat underside bore, spell 30b from the Book of the Dead. O my heart of my mother, O my heart of my different ages, do not stand up against me as a witness. Do not oppose me in the tribunal. Do not be hostile to me in the presence of the keeper of the balance. This spell addressed the heart directly, commanding it not to betray its owner during the crucial judgment scene. Egyptians believed the heart might speak against the deceased, revealing sins and crimes. The heart scarab magically compelled the heart to remain silent or testify favorably. Modern excavations have found heart scarabs in situ on mummies, positioned exactly over the heart. Some were simply wrapped into place. Others were secured with gold wire threaded through holes drilled in the scarab and passed around the mummy's torso. Pasheri and Aset placed Userhat's heart scarab, a magnificent piece of green basalt, 3 inches long, carved with exquisite detail directly on the chest over the heart's location. He secured it with a fine linen strip passed underneath the body and tied above the scarab, holding it firmly in place. Next came the Wadjet eye amulets, stylized eyes of Horus, representing healing and wholeness. Egyptian mythology told how Horus lost his eye in battle with Set, and Thoth magically restored it. The Wadjet eye therefore symbolized healing and restoration. Pascherina Set placed 2 small golden Wadjet eyes on Userhat's actual eye areas, protecting and symbolically restoring his vision for the afterlife. The DJ'd pillar amulet, representing Osiris's backbone and symbolizing stability and endurance, went on the lower back. The tight Isis knot amulet, providing goddess Isis protection, was placed on the upper chest. The headrest amulet, ensuring the deceased could rest comfortably and rise again, went beneath the neck. Additional amulets followed: the Ankh symbol of life, the Shen ring symbol of eternity, the 2-finger amulet representing the 2 fingers Horus used to help Osiris climb the ladder to heaven, the serpent head amulet protecting against snakebite in the underworld, and numerous small figures of protective deities. Each amulet required specific prayers during placement. The process took all of day 4 and part of day 5. When complete, Userhat's body was studded with nearly 40 amulets, each wrapped into position, each contributing its magical protection to his afterlife journey. With the amulets secured, the main body wrapping began in earnest. This proceeded in stages, with each stage creating a complete layer of wrapping from head to toe before the next stage began. The first full body wrapping used relatively coarse linen, strong, durable fabric that created a foundation for later layers. Pasheri and Aset and 2 assistants worked together, passing long linen strips under and over the body, spiraling from feet to head. They wrapped the torso separately from the limbs, creating distinct segments that were later joined. This first layer took 2 full days to complete. When finished, Userhat was encased in a cocoon of linen, about ½ an inch thick, completely covering the body except the face. The face remained exposed until the very final stages of wrapping. Between the first and second layers, Pascherina Set placed the first set of protective sheets, large pieces of fine linen painted or inscribed with religious text and protective scenes. These sheets, called mummy shrouds, featured images of protective deities, excerpt from the Book of the Dead, and magical diagrams. One shroud showed the sky goddess Nut spreading her wings protectively over the deceased. Another depicted the journey through the underworld, with illustrations of demons and obstacles Userhat would face, accompanied by spells to overcome each challenge. A third showed the judgment scene, Userhat's heart being weighed against the feather of Ma'at, with Anubis operating the scales and Thoth recording the results. These shrouds weren't mere decoration, they were magical shields. The images and text activated automatically, providing protection without requiring action from the deceased. Some shrouds functioned like magical armor, preventing demonic attacks. Others were like road maps, showing the deceased where to go and what to expect. The second wrapping layer began on day 8. This used medium-grade linen, finer than the first layer but not the finest quality. The wrapping pattern changed. Instead of spiraling continuously, the embalmers created a figure 8 pattern, crossing bands of linen over the chest in an X shape, then wrapping horizontally around the torso. This created a stronger, more complex structure, less likely to shift or unwrap. More amulets went in during the second layer, smaller protective charms placed at specific body points according to religious instructions. The assistant embalmers, working from memory and instruction, knew exactly where each type of amulet belonged. A small Anubis figure went on the left shoulder, a small Isis figure on the right shoulder. Tiny figures of the 4 sons of Horus went at the cardinal points around the torso. The third wrapping layer, begun on day 12, used the finest linen, nearly translucent fabric, woven so expertly that modern textile engineers marvel at its quality. This layer wasn't about structural protection, but about status and beauty. The finest outer wrappings announced to anyone who saw the mummy that this person was important, wealthy, and properly prepared for eternity. This fine linen was also the layer where decorative elements appeared. Some strips were dyed red for protection, yellow for divine favor, blue for resurrection. Others were edged with embroidered patterns or had prayers written on them in ink. Between the third and fourth layers went the most important protective sheet, the one bearing spell 151 from the Book of the Dead, a lengthy spell describing the mummy's construction and activating all its protective elements. This spell literally described the wrapping process as it enumerated which gods protected which body parts. The hair of Userhat is the hair of Nu. The face of Userhat is the face of Ra. The eyes of Userhat are the eyes of Hathor. By identifying each body part with a deity, the spell transformed the dead human into a divine composite, protected by the entire Egyptian pantheon. This wasn't metaphor. Egyptians believed the spell literally accomplished this transformation. The fourth and fifth wrapping layers continued the pattern, each adding thickness and protection. By day 16, Userhat's body had swollen from the shriveled, preserved form to a bulky mummy package, nearly twice the original body's width. The accumulated linen created a rigid structure that could protect the fragile, dried tissues within. Finally, on day 18, came the facial wrapping, the most delicate procedure of the entire process. Up until now, Userhat's face had remained exposed, allowing embalmers to check periodically that the features remained properly positioned and hadn't shifted during wrapping. Pasheri Neset personally performed the facial wrapping using the finest linen in the entire workshop, strips less than an inch wide, woven from the most delicate flax fibers. He began with the forehead, laying strips horizontally across, then the cheeks, wrapping carefully to maintain the contours. The nose required special attention. Wrapping too tightly would crush it, too loosely would leave it unprotected. As he wrapped each facial feature, Pasheri Neset recited specific spells. Spell for the mouth of Userhat, spell for the nose of Userhat, spell for the eyes of Userhat. These spells ensured that the deceased would be able to speak, breathe, and see in the afterlife, despite the face being wrapped in linen. The final facial element was the eye, covering 2 small pieces of finest linen, each painted with a protective wadjet eye, placed over Userhat's closed eyelids before the final wrapping enclosed everything. When archaeologists unwrap mummies and find these painted linen eye coverings, they're witnessing a practice meant to restore sight to the dead. With the face wrapped, Userhat had become fully anonymous, a linen-wrapped form without visible human features. The individual person had disappeared into the archetypal mummy. But the wrapping wasn't quite finished. The final stage involved the bandaging layers, broad sheets of linen wrapped around the entire mummy as a unit, creating a neat, smooth exterior. Pasheri Neset used sheets 10 to 15 feet long and 3 to 4 feet wide, passing them under and over the mummy, wrapping it like a giant cigar. Each bandage layer was heavily coated with liquid resin, which soaked into the linen and then hardened, creating a rigid, waterproof shell. By the time 4 bandage layers were applied, the mummy had transformed from soft linen wrapping to hard, dark shell, almost like a cocoon or chrysalis. The very final wrapping was special. A single large shroud of the finest linen dyed yellow, the color of gold, the color of eternity, the color of divine flesh. This shroud bore no writing or images, just pure yellow fabric representing the perfected state of the deceased. The shroud was secured with linen bands tied around the mummy at shoulders, waist, knees, and ankles. The knots weren't ordinary knots, but special sacred knots that magically couldn't be untied by demons or evil spirits. Some embalmers placed small wax seals over the knots, bearing protective symbols. On day 20, 70 days after Userhat entered the Per Nefer, the wrapping was complete. What emerged bore little resemblance to the man who died from crocodile attack. The mummy measured about 5 feet, 10 inches long, roughly Userhat's height, but was much broader and more rigid than any living human. It weighed approximately 80 pounds more than the 45-pound desiccated body, but far less than the 170-pound living man. Pasheri Neset and his assistants lifted the completed mummy onto a wooden carrying board. The surface was hard and smooth, the color a deep resinous brown-black. The form was clearly human head, torso, arms, legs, all distinctly visible but stylized, perfected, no longer individual. This transformation was entirely intentional. The mummy wasn't meant to preserve personal identity that was the job of tomb paintings, statues, and inscriptions. The mummy's purpose was to serve as a vessel for the Ka and Ba to reunite, and for that, a symbolic, perfected form was better than literal preservation of individual features. The question posed at this chapter's beginning, why use miles of linen, had multiple answers. Practically, the linen protected fragile dried tissue and maintained body shape. Religiously, each layer carried spells and protection. Socially, the amount and quality of linen demonstrated wealth and status. Symbolically, the wrapping process transformed the deceased from corpse into sacred object. Modern examinations of Egyptian mummies confirm the astonishing amount of linen involved. When French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero unwrapped the mummy of Pharaoh Amenhotep II in 1907, he documented over 700 square feet of linen bandages. The royal mummy of Seti I required 3 days of continuous unwrapping, with the linen strips filling several large baskets. Even more remarkably, when researchers carefully unwrap mummies and analyze the linen using modern techniques, they find that the ancient accounts were accurate. The amulets are where the texts say they should be. The spells are correctly positioned. The wrapping patterns match religious specifications. This wasn't haphazard work, it was precision craftsmanship executed consistently across centuries and regions. As Pasheri Neset looked at the completed mummy, he felt the satisfaction of work perfectly executed. Userhat was now ready for his cartonnage mask and coffins, which other artisans had been preparing while the mummification proceeded, then burial, then eternity. But one crucial ceremony remained, perhaps the most important ritual of all, without which all the preservation and wrapping would be spiritually meaningless. The opening of the mouth ceremony would restore Userhat's ability to eat, drink, breathe, speak, see, and hear in the afterlife. Without this ceremony, the mummy would be a perfectly preserved prison, trapping the soul in an inert shell. Tomorrow, at the tomb entrance, with the family assembled and the burial equipment prepared, the priest would perform the final magic. They would transform this wrapped bundle of preserved tissue and sacred linen into a living being capable of eternal existence. The Per Nefer's work was done. The temple's work was about to begin. Chapter 5. The opening of the mouth. Could magic truly reanimate the dead? Could a series of ritual gestures, spoken spells, and symbolic tools actually restore life functions to a body that had been dead for 70 days, desiccated with salt, and wrapped in hundreds of feet of linen? The morning sun broke over the Theban necropolis, painting the limestone cliffs gold and casting long shadows across the valley where Userhat would spend eternity. His tomb, a modest but well-appointed chamber carved into the hillside, had been under construction for the past 3 years, ever since Userhat reached sufficient status and wealth to begin preparing for death. The tomb entrance was crowded with mourners, priests, and funeral attendants. Userhat's widow, Nefertiti, stood at the front, her face painted with ceremonial grief, her clothing deliberately torn in ritual mourning. Her daughters and other female relatives surrounded her, wailing in the prescribed manner, loud, rhythmic crying that demonstrated proper respect for the dead. Professional mourners had been hired to supplement the family's grief display. These women specialists in funeral lamentation threw dust on their heads, beat their breasts, and cried out Userhat's name with practiced emotion. This wasn't cynical theater, but necessary religious protocol. The gods needed to see that Userhat was properly mourned. Insufficient grief might suggest he wasn't worthy of resurrection. The mummy arrived on a sledge pulled by oxen, accompanied by Pasheri Neset and his assistants. Behind them came servants carrying Userhat's canopic jars in a special shrine, his shabti figures, magical servants who would perform labor for him in the afterlife, furniture for the tomb, food offerings, clothing, jewelry, weapons, cosmetics, games, and the countless other items Egyptians believed the dead would need in the eternal paradise. This funeral procession, depicted in countless tomb paintings, followed routes from the embalming workshop through the city to the western necropolis. These weren't somber, quiet affairs, but loud, public spectacles involving sometimes hundreds of participants. The procession announced to the community that a member had died and was being properly honored. It demonstrated the family's wealth and devotion. It ensured the deceased was sent to eternity with all due ceremony. At the tomb entrance, the mummy was placed upright, standing on its feet, facing east toward the rising sun. This positioning was crucial. The ceremony required the mummy to see the sun, the principal life-giving force in Egyptian cosmology. The Sim priest, the official who would perform the opening of the mouth ceremony, now approached. He wore the distinctive leopard skin robe of his office, with the animal's head hanging over his shoulder. This garment identified him as a Sim priest, one of the religious specialists trained in the complex rituals that activated mummies for the afterlife. The Sim priest was typically the deceased's eldest son, who inherited not just property but religious responsibilities. However, if the son was too young, unavailable, or if there was no son, a professional Sim priest could be hired. For Userhat, his eldest son Amenhotep, a young man of 19, would perform the ceremony under the guidance of an experienced temple priest. The opening of the mouth ceremony was perhaps the most important ritual in all of Egyptian religion. Yet its origins were ancient and mysterious even to the Egyptians of Userhat's time. The ritual dated back to the Old Kingdom, over 1,000 years before Userhat, and some elements possibly originated in pre-dynastic times. By the New Kingdom, the ceremony had evolved into a complex, multi-hour ritual involving 75 separate episodes, each with specific actions, speeches, and symbolic meanings. The ceremony's purpose was to reverse the effects of death. When a person died, Egyptians believed all their senses ceased functioning. They couldn't see, hear, smell, taste, or speak. The mouth, in particular, became sealed, preventing eating, drinking, and speaking. The opening of the mouth ritual magically opened these sealed senses, restoring full function to the deceased. But this wasn't resurrection in the sense of restoring physical life. The ceremony enabled the deceased to function in the afterlife, a spiritual existence that paralleled physical life but occurred in a different realm. The body remained dead, but the Ka life force, and Ba, personality, soul, could reunite with it and use it as a base for afterlife activities. Amenhotep, his hands ritually purified and his body freshly shaved according to priestly requirements, approached his father's mummy. The guiding priest handed him the first ritual implement, the Pesish Kaf, a forked metal blade originally used in birth rituals to cut the umbilical cord. Symbolically, the opening of the mouth was a rebirth, and the Pesish Kaf's presence evoked that parallel. The priest recited the first spell. Your mouth was closed, but I have set in order your mouth and your teeth for you. Amenhotep touched the Pesish Kaf to the mummy's mouth area, making symbolic cutting motions. This gesture represented severing the bonds of death. Next came the first purification. Assistants brought forward vessels containing water and natron solution. The priest splashed these liquids toward the mummy while reciting purification spells. This wasn't random. Specific spells corresponded to specific purifications. 4 purifications with water represented the 4 cardinal directions. 4 purifications with natron represented the 4 primeval deities of the Ogdoad cosmology. The ceremony proceeded through its episodes with precise timing and sequence. Each action built on the previous one, creating a cumulative magical effect. Modern scholars have reconstructed the ceremony structure from ancient texts and tomb paintings showing the ritual in progress. Episodes 10 to 15 involve fumigation with incense. Assistants brought censers filled with burning frankincense and myrrh, waving the fragrant smoke over the mummy. The smoke had multiple symbolic meanings. It pleased the gods who love sweet smells. It purified the deceased, and it created a sacred atmosphere separating the ritual space from the profane world. Episodes 16 to 22 introduced various ritual tools. The Hekau, a serpent-headed wand, representing magical power. The ceremonial adze, a copper blade shaped like a woodworking tool. The Setep, a vessel for libations, and others. Each tool touched specific parts of the mummy while specific spells were recited. The adze was particularly important, Made from meteoric iron, literally metal from the sky, the adze carried celestial power. When touched to the mummy's mouth, it transferred star power to the deceased. Tomb paintings show the adze ceremony with remarkable consistency across centuries, always depicting the tool at the same angle, held in the same hand, touching the same mouth location. Modern analysis of ancient ceremonial adzes confirms they were indeed made from meteoric iron. The Egyptians didn't understand metallurgy of iron from ore until very late in their history, but they recognized meteoric iron as special. It fell from the sky. They sometimes witnessed the falls. It was harder than copper or bronze, and it contained nickel that gave it unusual properties. For religious implements, meteoric iron was perfect, literally God-sent material from the realm of the stars. Episodes 23 to 30 involved animal sacrifices. 2 cattle, one from Upper Egypt, one from Lower Egypt, symbolizing the unified nation, were slaughtered at the tomb entrance. The blood was collected and sprinkled toward the mummy. The right foreleg of one bull was cut off immediately after slaughter, while the muscles still twitched with residual nerve activity. This twitching foreleg, the most dramatic element of the ceremony, was held up to the mummy's mouth. The symbolism was powerful and direct. The foreleg represented strength and mobility, and its twitching represented life continuing even after death. By touching it to the mummy's mouth, the Sim priest transferred that life force to the deceased. Contemporary observers found this element particularly striking. Ancient texts describe crowds gasping when the twitching foreleg touched the mummy, believing they could see the life force transfer occurring. Whether this was genuine belief or religious theater, it clearly made a powerful impression. The sacrificed cattle weren't wasted. Their meat would be distributed among the funeral participants and temple personnel, with portions also left as offerings in the tomb. The economic scale of elite funerals was substantial. The sacrificial cattle alone represented significant wealth. Episodes 31 to 42 focus specifically on the mouth, eyes, ears, and nose. For each sense organ, specific spells were recited while ritual tools touched the mummy. The ceremony literally addressed each body part. Your mouth is opened, your eyes are opened, your ears are unstopped, your nose breathes. Modern readers might view this as sympathetic magic, the belief that symbolic actions create real effects. But Egyptians didn't distinguish between symbolic and real as modern Western thought does. To them, the properly performed ritual genuinely accomplished what it symbolized. The magic wasn't like opening the mouth, it actually opened the mouth. Episodes 43 to 55 involved more purifications, more incense, and the presentation of various symbolic objects. An ostrich feather representing Ma'at and truth, various colored stones representing protective deities, special bread loaves representing sustenance, wine representing blood and life, and oils representing divine essence. Each object was first presented to the mummy, then either placed in the tomb or ritually destroyed. The presentation transferred the object's essence to the deceased. The physical object became unnecessary once its spiritual essence had been magically conveyed. Episodes 56 to 64 dealt with clothing and adornment. The mummy was symbolically dressed in fine linen. It was already wrapped, but the ceremony added magical clothing over the physical wrappings. It was given sandals so it could walk in the afterlife, a staff symbol of authority, jewelry demonstrating status, and amulets providing protection. The Sim priest placed a golden finger sheath on the mummy's right index finger. This simple object carried profound meaning. The finger represented the deity Atum's creative power. In Egyptian cosmology, Atum created the universe through masturbation, using his hand, finger. By giving the deceased a golden finger, the ceremony granted them creative power in the afterlife. Episodes 65 to 72 involved the final consecrations. The mummy was declared to have been accepted by the gods. Its transformation was confirmed and sealed. The deceased was pronounced ready for burial and afterlife existence. The concluding episodes, 73 to 75, were formulaic declarations that everything had been done correctly, that all gods had been satisfied, that the deceased was now properly equipped for eternity. These weren't mere formalities, they were magical confirmations that sealed the entire ceremony's effects. Throughout this multi-hour ritual, Nefertiti and the family maintained their mourning display. But as the ceremony approached its conclusion, the mourning's character changed. The initial grief-stricken wailing shifted to something more like celebration. The deceased wasn't lost, he was transformed, reborn, elevated to a higher state of existence. This emotional arc from grief to acceptance to celebration appears in tomb paintings showing funeral scenes. Early in the procession, mourners are depicted in extremes of sorrow. By the ceremony's end, they're shown making offering gestures and speaking words of encouragement to the deceased. With the opening of the mouth complete, the final stage of burial could proceed. The mummy was carried into the tomb chamber and placed in its coffin, actually a nest of 3 coffins, each fitting inside the next, all covered with protective spells and images. The tomb chamber had been decorated with paintings showing Userhat's life achievements, his family, and scenes from the afterlife he hoped to enjoy. One wall showed Userhat hunting in the marshes, not the crocodile hunt that killed him, but an idealized scene of successful hunting, eternally repeating. Another wall showed the judgment scene, with Userhat's heart being weighed and found pure. A third showed the field of reeds, the paradise where worthy souls spent eternity. The canopic jars were placed in their special shrine near the coffin. The Shabti figures 367 of them, one for each day of the Egyptian year, plus 36 overseer Shabtis were arranged in boxes. Food offerings, wine jars, furniture, games, weapons, tools, and countless other items filled the chamber. Finally, with everything in place, the tomb was sealed. Workers bricked up the entrance and plastered over it. The necropolis guards were notified of the new tomb's location so they could watch for tomb robbers. Nefertiti and the family left offerings at the tomb entrance and departed. The question posed at this chapter's beginning, could magic truly reanimate the dead, received its answer in Egyptian belief? Absolutely yes. The opening of the mouth ceremony didn't restore physical life. The body remained mummified and inert, but it activated spiritual life. The deceased could now see, hear, speak, eat, drink, and function in the afterlife realm. Modern skeptics might dismiss this as superstition, but consider, the Egyptians maintained these beliefs and practices for over 3,000 years longer than Christianity has existed, longer than Islam has existed. The ceremonies were performed by educated priests who were also astronomers, mathematicians, and administrators. These weren't ignorant primitives, but sophisticated thinkers who had different metaphysical assumptions than modern materialists. Moreover, the ceremony's psychological effects were real and important. It provided closure for grieving families, it marked the final transition from death to afterlife, and it demonstrated that everything possible had been done for the deceased. In cultures where funerary ritual provides these psychological functions, the rituals work regardless of whether their metaphysical claims are objectively true. As Pashirianaset walked back to the Per Nefer after the ceremony, he reflected that his work was complete. Userhat had been transformed from crocodile victim to eternal being. The 70-day process of evisceration, desiccation, restoration, wrapping, and opening has successfully guided another soul to immortality. Tomorrow would bring new bodies, new families, new challenges. The work never ended because death never ended. But if death was inevitable, the Egyptian answer, elaborate preservation, magical protection, and spiritual transformation offered hope that death wasn't final. 3,000 years later, Userhat's mummy would remain preserved, his tomb paintings still visible, his name still readable. Whether his soul truly found paradise, whether the spells worked, whether the magic was real, these questions remained unanswerable, but the physical preservation was undeniable. The Egyptians had defeated decay, if not death itself. Chapter 6. The Sacred Chemistry. What substances preserved flesh for millennia? What specific chemical compounds, natural substances, and material combinations allowed Egyptian embalmers to preserve human tissue for 3,000 years or more, outlasting civilizations, surviving tomb robberies, enduring museum storage? In a modern laboratory at the University of Cairo, Dr. Salima Ikram carefully extracted a tiny sample from an ancient mummy, a mere pinprick of desiccated tissue. This sample, no larger than a grain of sand, would be subjected to gas chromatography mass spectrometry, revealing the precise chemical composition of substances the embalmers used 25 centuries ago. The results when they appeared on the computer screen, confirmed what ancient text had described: a sophisticated mixture of plant resins, essential oils, beeswax, animal fats, and mineral salts. But the ratios and specific compounds showed something the ancient text hadn't recorded. The embalmers understood empirically what modern chemistry would explain molecularly. Let's journey back to Userhat's time and explore the chemistry of mummification as ancient embalmers understood it through practical experience, even without modern chemical terminology. The foundation of all Egyptian preservation was natron, but what exactly was this miracle substance? Modern chemical analysis reveals natron as a naturally occurring mixture of 4 sodium compounds. Sodium carbonate Na, 2CO3, approximately 50% of the mixture. Sodium bicarbonate, NHCO, 3, approximately 35%. Sodium chloride, NaCl, table salt, approximately 10%. Sodium sulfate, Na, 2So4, approximately 5%. This specific combination created properties that no single compound possessed alone. The sodium carbonate raised pH to alkaline levels around pH 10, inhibiting bacterial growth. The sodium bicarbonate buffered the mixture, preventing pH from rising so high it destroyed tissue structure. The sodium chloride drew out moisture through osmosis. The sodium sulfate acted as a desiccant, binding water molecules. Egyptians mined natron from dried lake beds in Wadi Natron, 60 miles northwest of modern Cairo. The seasonal lakes flooded during winter, dissolved minerals from surrounding rock, then evaporated during summer, leaving thick natron deposits. Workers harvested these deposits, transported them down the Nile, and sold them to embalmers throughout Egypt. Interestingly, the specific mineral composition of Wadi Natron was nearly ideal for mummification. Had the Egyptians been forced to use sea salt, pure sodium chloride, mummification would have been less effective. Sea salt desiccates tissue but lacks the pH-raising carbonates that inhibit bacterial growth. Had they used pure sodium carbonate, as from certain other deposits, the extreme alkalinity would have destroyed tissue structure, turning bodies into formless mush. Wadi Natron represented an accidental perfection nature, providing exactly the right mixture for the technique Egyptians developed. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Egyptians developed their technique around the material available to them, and the technique succeeded precisely because that material was well suited to preservation. But natron alone, while effective at desiccation, wouldn't produce the dark, aromatic, resin-coated mummies found in tombs. For that, embalmers added layers of organic substances, each chosen for specific properties. Pine resin, imported from Lebanon's famous cedar forests, served as the primary coating material. This resin, technically the tree's defensive secretion against injury and infection, contained numerous compounds with preservative properties: abietic acid and other resin acids. These created acidic conditions, pH 4 to 5, on the mummy's surface, opposite to natron's alkalinity. Bacteria that might survive alkaline conditions couldn't survive acidic ones, and vice versa. The combination provided protection across the pH spectrum. Terpenes, pannine, limonene. These volatile compounds gave the resin its characteristic pine scent. They also had antimicrobial properties, killing or inhibiting bacteria and fungi. Rosin sulfide, resin acids. When heated and applied as liquid, rosin penetrated fabric weaves and tissue pores. Upon cooling, it hardened into a waterproof, airtight barrier, preventing moisture, intrusion, and gas exchange that would promote decay. Pine resin was expensive. It required importing raw material from Lebanon, either as crude sap or as processed blocks. The trade in Levantine pine products was substantial enough to appear in diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and northern kingdoms. Poor families couldn't afford imported pine resin, using local tree saps instead, less effective but more affordable. Myrrh resin from commiphora trees native to Somalia and Arabia was even more expensive than pine resin. But small amounts went a long way, and myrrh provided properties pine resin didn't. Sesquiterpenes, particularly beta-elamine, modern research shows these compounds have genuine antimicrobial effects against decay-causing bacteria. Furanudesma 1,3-diene. This tongue-twisting compound is a powerful antifungal agent. In the humid environment of wrapped mummies where condensation could form between linen layers, Fungal growth was a real risk. Myrrh prevented it. Volatile oils. These gave myrrh its distinctive balsamic scent, considered religiously appropriate and pleasing to the gods. Embalmers typically dissolved myrrh resin in palm wine or heated it until liquid, then mixed it with other substances to create complex preservation mixtures. Pure myrrh was too expensive to use liberally, but myrrh-enhanced mixtures provided its benefits while controlling costs. Frankincense, from boswellia trees also native to Somalia and Arabia, was used more in ritual fumigation than in direct body treatment. But some wealthy mummies show chemical evidence of frankincense in their wrapping resins. Boswellic acids. These have anti-inflammatory properties. Modern medicine investigates them for treating arthritis and other conditions. While inflammation wasn't relevant to dead tissue, boswellic acids also possess antimicrobial properties. Incensyl acetate. This compound, identified by modern research, affects emotion and anxiety in living brains. Ancient embalmers couldn't have known this, but they considered frankincense spiritually elevating, possibly because the incensyl acetate in the smoke actually altered consciousness in ceremony participants. Cassia and cinnamon from the bark of related cinnamomum trees native to Sri Lanka and southern India added both scent and preservation. Cinnamaldehyde. The primary flavoring compound in cinnamon, this substance is a potent antimicrobial agent. Modern food preservation uses it to extend shelf life. Ancient embalmers used it for similar purposes. Also found in cloves, this compound has anesthetic and antiseptic properties. It kills bacteria and fungi while creating a pleasant, spicy scent. Cassia and cinnamon were extraordinarily expensive, coming from the farthest reaches of the ancient trade networks. Only elite mummies received these substances, and then only in small quantities mixed with more affordable materials. Palm oil and other plant oils served multiple purposes. They dissolved and dispersed resin compounds that wouldn't mix with water. They kept desiccated skin pliable during restoration and wrapping, preventing cracking and tearing. They filled microscopic spaces in dry tissue, excluding air and moisture. They added calories and organic compounds that, paradoxically, fed beneficial chemical reactions while their antimicrobial companions prevented bacterial growth. Cedar oil, distilled from cedar wood through processes that required considerable technological sophistication, was particularly valued. It had strong preservative properties due to sesquiterpene compounds. It penetrated tissue deeply due to its liquid nature and chemical affinity for organic materials. It had religious significance, cedar being associated with divine permanence and strength. Some evidence suggests embalmers injected cedar oil into body cavities or even into tissue itself using hollow bronze tubes, an ancient form of tissue injection that predates modern embalming injection by millennia. Beeswax played a specialized role. Mixed with resins, it improved flow properties when heated, allowing the mixture to penetrate fabric weave more thoroughly. It lowered the melting point of resin mixtures, allowing application at temperatures that wouldn't damage linen. It created flexible rather than brittle coatings. Pure resin could crack, but wax-modified resin remained slightly pliable. It served as a sealant for incisions, nostrils, and other body openings. Chemically, beeswax is a complex mixture of esters, fatty acids, and hydrocarbons. Its water-repellent properties made it ideal for creating moisture barriers. Mineral compounds beyond natron also appeared. Red ochre, iron oxide. Used for cosmetic coloring, it also provided some antimicrobial effects. Iron oxides create oxidative stress for bacteria. Malachite and galena. These copper and lead minerals were used in cosmetics for the living and were sometimes applied to mummy faces. Both have antimicrobial properties. Copper and lead are toxic to microorganisms and to humans in large quantities, which is why these cosmetics probably contributed to health problems in ancient Egypt. Bitumen, natural, in later periods. When expensive imported resins became scarce, embalmers substituted bitumen petroleum-derived material that occurs naturally in Middle Eastern seeps. Bitumen created waterproof coatings, but lacked the antimicrobial properties of botanical resins. Mummies preserved with bitumen tend to be more degraded than those using traditional resins. The chemistry of preservation worked through multiple simultaneous mechanisms. 1. Desiccation. Removing water eliminated the medium bacteria required for metabolism. 2. pH manipulation. Alkaline natron and acidic resins created environments hostile to decay organisms. 3. Antimicrobial compounds. Numerous plant chemicals actively killed or inhibited microorganisms. 4. Oxygen exclusion. Resin coatings and tight wrapping prevented oxygen access, stopping aerobic decay. 5. Chemical cross-linking. Some compounds cause proteins in dead tissue to cross-link, form chemical bonds between molecules, creating more stable structures resistant to breakdown. Modern experimental archaeology has tested whether these ancient techniques genuinely work. In the 1994 Breyer-Wade mummification experiment mentioned earlier, researchers used only materials and methods available to ancient Egyptians: natron, linen, pine resin, myrrh, frankincense, and basic tools. The result, after 35 days in natron and subsequent wrapping, was a successfully mummified human cadaver that showed no signs of decay. Chemical analysis confirmed that tissue preservation was occurring through the same mechanisms ancient embalmers used. When the experimental mummy was examined after several years of storage, it remained perfectly preserved, proving the techniques genuinely work. More tellingly, when modern researchers analyze ancient mummies using the most sophisticated analytical techniques available, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, DNA analysis, isotope studies, they consistently find that tissue preservation is genuine and stable. A well-prepared mummy isn't slowly degrading. It's in equilibrium, chemically stable for indefinite periods if kept dry. 3,000-year-old mummy tissue, when examined under electron microscopes, shows cellular structures still intact. DNA can still be extracted, though fragmented. Proteins can still be identified. The preservation isn't superficial, it extends to the molecular level. This remarkable preservation arose not from a single miracle substance, but from a sophisticated combination of materials and processes. The embalmer's genius lay in understanding, through empirical observation across generations, that multiple preservation mechanisms working together were more effective than any single approach. Different materials address different aspects of decay. The sequence matter desiccation before coating, wrapping after both. Quality of materials directly affected quality of results. They couldn't explain why these substances worked in modern chemical terms, but they knew that they did work. They'd seen the results in every successfully preserved body. They'd witnessed the failures when inferior materials were used or procedures were rushed. This empirical knowledge, developed through observation, transmitted through apprenticeship, refined across centuries, represents genuine science, even without modern theoretical frameworks. The embalmers were practical chemists, using experimental methods to determine what worked and standardizing successful techniques. Their success is proven every time a museum opens an ancient Egyptian sarcophagus and finds inside not a pile of bones and dust, but a recognizably human form with preserved facial features, identifiable internal organs, and intact tissue, a testament to the chemistry they mastered 3,000 years before modern chemistry existed as a science. The sacred chemistry of mummification combined the gifts of earth, natron salts, trees, resins, and oils, bees, wax, and human knowledge, technique, and sequence to achieve something nature alone rarely accomplishes: the indefinite preservation of organic tissue. In doing so, ancient Egyptian embalmers created time capsules containing not just the past, but physical matter from the past. Unchanged across millennia, bodies that would outlast their civilization, survive conquest and conversion, endure through the ages as witnesses to human mortality and humanity's refusal to accept that mortality as final. Chapter 7. When mummification went wrong, what horrors lurked in failed preservation? What gruesome discoveries awaited archaeologists who opened tombs expecting perfectly preserved mummies, but instead found nightmarish evidence that ancient preservation had catastrophically failed? The tomb had been sealed for 26 centuries when British archaeologist Theodore Davis's team broke through the plastered doorway in 1907. The seals were intact, suggesting tomb robbers had never violated this particular burial. Excitement ran high, an unplundered tomb often meant spectacular finds. The sarcophagus lid required 6 men to lift. As it rose, a putrid smell, impossible after so many centuries, yet undeniable, wafted from the opening. One worker gagged and stepped back. Davis himself leaned forward with a lamp, eager to see what treasures awaited. What he saw made him recoil in disgust. Instead of a neatly wrapped mummy, the sarcophagus contained a dark, viscous mass that had once been a human body. The wrappings had disintegrated into pulp. The tissue beneath hadn't desiccated but had partially liquefied, creating a horrifying soup of decomposed flesh, dissolved resin, and rotted linen. The smell was indescribable, a concentration of decay that should have dissipated millennia ago but had been sealed in airtight conditions, preserving the stench as effectively as better tombs preserved bodies. This was mummification gone catastrophically wrong, and it happened more often than the pristine museum mummies would suggest. Let's explore what could go wrong during the 70-day process, why it went wrong, and what the consequences were for the deceased, the embalmers, and modern archaeologists who discovered these failures. The first potential failure point was timing. If a body wasn't brought to embalmers within 24 to 48 hours of death, decomposition began irreversibly. In Egypt's heat, bacterial proliferation occurred rapidly. The intestines, full of bacteria even in living people, bloated with gas as those bacteria multiplied unchecked. The body swelled, skin discolored, and putrefaction began. Some families, particularly in remote areas or cases of unexpected death while traveling, couldn't deliver bodies quickly enough. By the time the corpse arrived at the Per Nefer, it was already partially decomposed. Skilled embalmers could still attempt preservation, but the results were compromised from the start. Archaeological evidence confirms this. Some mummies, when CT scanned, show internal structures consistent with partial decomposition before preservation. Gas pockets in tissue, collapsed organ structures, and chemical signatures of bacterial activity all indicate the body was already degrading when treatment began. The embalmer solution was aggressive intervention, extra thorough evisceration removing all potentially contaminated tissue, extended natron treatment, sometimes 60+ days instead of the standard 40, and heavy resin coating to seal and stabilize what remained. The results were technically preserved, but aesthetically poor. These mummies tend to be darker, more shriveled, and more irregular in shape than ideally preserved specimens. The second major failure point was incomplete desiccation. If natron treatment was insufficient, too short in duration, too little natron used, or natron that was old and already saturated from previous uses, moisture remained in the tissue. This trapped moisture became a time bomb. Initially, the mummy might look acceptable. It was wrapped, resin coated, and buried. But inside the sealed tomb, over years and decades, the residual moisture enabled slow bacterial and fungal growth. The wrappings might appear intact from outside, while inside, the tissue putrefied. When archaeologists opened such tombs, they often found mummies that seemed well wrapped, but were hollow. The tissue had completely decomposed within the wrappings, leaving only bones surrounded by empty linen shells. The weight was the giveaway. A properly preserved mummy was light but substantial, while a failed mummy was suspiciously light, sometimes weighing less than the wrappings alone should weigh. The most scientifically documented case of incomplete desiccation involves the mummy known as Pum II, Philadelphia University Museum Specimen 2, studied extensively in the 1,970 seconds. When unwrapped and examined, Pum II showed evidence of post-mummification decomposition. Chemical analysis detected butyric acid and other decay compounds that should have been absent in properly preserved tissue. The conclusion: this mummy had been incompletely desiccated, allowing slow decay within the wrappings. The third failure mode was environmental. Even perfectly preserved mummies could be destroyed by post-burial conditions. Tomb flooding was the most catastrophic. If the water table rose, as occasionally happened with Nile flood patterns changing over centuries, or if rainwater leaked through cracks in tomb seals, the mummy was doomed. Water rehydrated the desiccated tissue, immediately reversing the preservation. Bacterial spores dormant for centuries in the dry mummy activated when moisture returned. Within weeks, a mummy that had survived 2,000 years could become a putrid mass of rotting tissue. Archaeologists working in Lower Egypt, closer to the Nile and its fluctuating water table, report higher rates of mummy degradation than those working in Upper Egypt's drier southern regions. The valley's hydrology directly affected preservation success rates. Insect infestation represented another environmental failure. Dermestid beetles, the same insects taxidermists use today to clean skeletal specimens, could devastate mummies. These beetles consume dried organic tissue, burrowing through wrappings to reach the preserved flesh beneath. A severe infestation, could reduce a mummy to crumbling fragments and beetle frass, insect excrement. Evidence of ancient insect damage appears in many mummies. CT scans reveal tunnel networks through tissue consistent with beetle larvae activity. Some mummies show damage patterns suggesting infestation occurred shortly after burial, possibly from insects sealed in the tomb accidentally or attracted by organic materials in the burial goods. The fourth failure mode was technical error during mummification itself. Despite generations of accumulated knowledge, embalmers were human and made mistakes. Brain removal could go wrong. If the embalmer pushed the bronze hook too aggressively, it could penetrate through the brain case's roof into the facial bones, creating visible damage. If the hook slipped laterally instead of angling upward, it could pierce through the thin bone beside the nose into the eye socket, destroying the eye area. Some mummies show catastrophic facial damage from brain removal errors. Evisceration could be botched. An inexperienced embalmer might cut too deeply, slicing into the spinal column and severely weakening the body structure. Or the incision might be placed wrong, too high, damaging the diaphragm, too low, cutting into the pelvis. One mummy examined by Dr. Salima Ikram showed evidence that the embalmer had accidentally removed the heart along with the other organs, a fatal error spiritually, since the heart was supposed to remain for afterlife judgment. The evisceration error would only be discovered after the organs were removed and separated. At that point, the embalmer faced a terrible choice: inform the family that their loved one was doomed to spiritual oblivion because the heart was gone, or secretly return the heart to the body cavity and hope it wasn't noticed. Evidence suggests embalmers sometimes chose the latter option. CT scans occasionally reveal hearts placed in anatomically incorrect positions, suggesting they were removed accidentally and then put back. Wrapping could fail if done improperly. Insufficient resin between layers meant the wrappings could shift and loosen. If the mummy was moved before the resin fully hardened, the wrappings might slip, creating bulges and gaps. Poor wrapping tension, too tight or too loose, affected long-term stability. Some mummies show sliding damage where the wrappings clearly shifted at some point, creating compressed areas where layers bunched together and empty areas where they pulled apart. This usually happened when mummies were moved during funeral processions or when adjusting them in their coffins. The fifth failure mode was economic, when families couldn't or wouldn't pay for adequate preservation. Herodotus described 3 levels of mummification service, with the cheapest involving no evisceration at all, just an injection of cedar oil into the rectum, which supposedly dissolved the internal organs, followed by brief natron treatment. Archaeological evidence confirms this economy method existed, though its effectiveness was questionable. Some mummies show no evisceration incision but do show evidence of internal organ dissolution. However, many economy mummies are poorly preserved, suggesting the quick and cheap method didn't work well. The economics of mummification created pressure to cut corners. Embalmers might reuse natron beyond its effective life. They might substitute cheap local tree sap for expensive imported resins. They might reduce treatment time to handle more clients. They might employ undertrained assistants for specialized procedures. These cost-cutting measures produced inferior results, but poor families had no alternative. Some preservation was better than none. Even a poorly mummified body had a better chance in the afterlife than an unpreserved corpse dumped in the desert. The sixth failure mode was deliberate: tomb robbery. Tomb robbers weren't interested in mummies. They wanted the jewelry, gold, and valuables buried with them. But in extracting those valuables, robbers ripped apart mummies with brutal efficiency. A robber would tear open wrappings searching for amulets and jewelry wrapped between layers. They'd smash through the chest seeking the valuable heart scarab. They'd break off fingers to remove gold rings. They'd decapitate mummies to steal golden facial masks. They'd rip open the abdomen looking for valuables that might have been placed in the body cavity. Many mummies in museums show evidence of ancient robbery damage. The wrappings are torn irregularly, unlike archaeological unwrapping, which proceeds systematically. Finger bones are missing, heads are detached, chest cavities are broken open. These mummies were preserved successfully by embalmers, but destroyed by thieves, sometimes within years of burial, sometimes centuries later. Interestingly, tomb robbery was so common in ancient Egypt that some periods saw over 90% of tombs robbed. The Valley of the Kings, supposed to be the most secure necropolis, was almost completely looted by 1000 BCE, barely 300 years after most burials occurred. Tutankhamun's tomb survived not because it was well hidden, but because it was small and relatively unimpressive, overshadowed by larger royal tombs that attracted robbers' attention first. The seventh failure mode emerged in modern times: museum mishandling. Victorian-era Egyptologists often treated mummies as curiosities rather than human remains deserving respect. Public unwrapping events were popular entertainment. Wealthy collectors hosted mummy parties, where a mummy was unwrapped before invited guests. These unwrappings were destructive. No documentation occurred. The goal was entertainment, not science. Wrappings were ripped off and discarded. Amulets and artifacts were distributed to guests as souvenirs. The body itself was often destroyed in the process, cut apart with no care for preservation. One infamous case involved the mummy of Princess Nefret, unwrapped at a private party in London in 1863. According to contemporary accounts, the host served refreshments, musicians played, and the unwrapping proceeded like a theatrical performance. By evening's end, Nefret's mummy was scattered in pieces across the room, her wrappings were being worn as scarves by female guests, and her amulets had been pocketed as party favors. Only a few bone fragments survived, now lost. Even scientific unwrappings in museums could be damaging. Early techniques involved forcing instruments between wrapping layers, tearing the fabric. The bodies were exposed to air without humidity control, causing rapid desiccation changes. Some mummies were coated with varnishes or preservatives that actually accelerated decay. Modern conservation techniques are far more sophisticated, using CT scanning to examine mummies without unwrapping them, controlled climate storage to prevent degradation, and careful documentation when physical examination is necessary. But many mummies in museum collections show damage from earlier, less careful handling. The ultimate question these failures raise is, did the ancient Egyptians know their preservation sometimes failed? Evidence suggests yes, they knew, and they took steps to address it. Quality control existed in elite embalming workshops. Bodies were inspected at multiple stages. Families sometimes hired independent priests to oversee the process, ensuring embalmers performed all procedures correctly. Payment was often staged, partial payment up front, remainder on delivery of acceptable results. Some papyri contain what appear to be embalmer oaths or professional codes, promises to perform work conscientiously, to use fresh materials, to follow all religious requirements. These wouldn't exist unless there had been problems with embalmers cutting corners or performing shoddy work. When problems occurred, consequences could be severe. An embalmer who delivered a poorly preserved mummy might face demands for refunded payment. In extreme cases, such as religious errors that condemn the deceased to spiritual oblivion, embalmers could face criminal charges. Some legal texts mention cases of embalmers accused of negligence or fraud. But the Egyptians also understood that some failures were unavoidable. Bodies delivered late, bodies damaged by trauma, bodies of the extremely obese or extremely emaciated all presented challenges that even expert embalmers couldn't fully overcome. The understanding seems to have been that embalmers should do their best with the material presented, but couldn't guarantee results when circumstances were unfavorable. For modern archaeologists and museum curators, failed mummies present both challenges and opportunities. The challenges are obvious. Degraded remains are unpleasant to study, difficult to conserve, and offer less scientific information than well-preserved specimens. But the opportunities are significant. Failed mummies reveal what could go wrong, teaching us about the preservation process by showing its limits. They demonstrate that mummification wasn't magic but science, a science that worked when done correctly, but failed when mistakes occurred or circumstances were unfavorable. Moreover, even failed mummies contain information. DNA can sometimes be extracted from degraded tissue. Isotope analysis can reveal diet and origin. Pathology can be studied in bone even when soft tissue is gone. A failed mummy is still a window into the past, even if that window is cracked and distorted. The horror stories, tombs reeking of ancient decay, mummies dissolved into organic soup, bodies destroyed by beetles or rot, serve as reminders that mummification's success was never guaranteed. The beautiful, perfectly preserved specimens in museum displays represent the successes, but beneath those successes lay countless failures. Bodies dumped, improperly preserved, families devastated by botched procedures, embalmers struggling against decomposition and losing. Yet the remarkable fact remains. The successes outnumbered the failures by enough that Egyptian mummification is considered the ancient world's most effective preservation technique. For every horror story of catastrophic decay, there are dozens of mummies that worked exactly as intended, bodies preserved for millennia, surviving tomb robberies, surviving museum mishandling, surviving climate changes, remaining stable and intact enough to study with modern science. The failures teach us that success was hard-won, requiring skill, materials, time, and favorable circumstances. The successes teach us that, when all factors aligned, ancient Egyptian embalmers achieved something remarkable. They made human bodies practically immortal, conquering decay through chemistry and craft that wouldn't be equaled until modern formaldehyde-based embalming was developed in the 19th century. And even modern embalming doesn't aim for the timescale Egyptian preservation achieved. Today's embalmed bodies preserve for weeks or months. Egyptian mummies have lasted for millennia and show no signs of degrading if kept in stable conditions. In that sense, the ancient art still surpasses modern science. Chapter 8. The Sacred Tools. Could bronze implements perform surgery on death? How did ancient bronze implement soft metal tools that could barely hold an edge perform delicate surgical procedures on human bodies that would challenge modern surgeons with their stainless steel instruments? In the flickering lamplight of the Per Nefer, Pashri and Aset's tool collection gleamed with the dark luster of well-maintained bronze. Each implement hung in its designated place on the workshop's eastern wall, arranged not randomly, but in the specific order they'd be used during mummification. These tools represented generations of refinement, shapes, and sizes, perfected through centuries of practical use, passed down from master to apprentice, maintained with religious care. To modernize, the tools seem crude. Bronze blades that corrode, handles of simple wood, no precision mechanisms or adjustable components. Yet in skilled hands, these implements accomplish procedures that still impress modern surgeons and forensic pathologists. Let's examine each tool, understanding its purpose, construction, and the techniques used with it. The peseshkaf was the first tool used in ritual terms, though not in practical sequence. This forked metal blade, usually about 6 inches long, had 2 tines like a narrow tuning fork. Its original use was in birth rituals, cutting umbilical cords. In mummification, it served ceremonial purposes during the opening of the mouth, touching the mummy's mouth to symbolically cut the bonds of death. Metallurgically, the peseshkaf was typically made from bronze alloyed with slightly higher tin content than usual, perhaps 12–15% tin versus the standard 10%, making it harder and able to hold a sharper edge. The forked shape wasn't accidental, it prevented the blade from cutting too deeply, an important safety feature when working near newborns or performing symbolic operations where actual cutting would be disastrous. The brain hook remains the most infamous implement of Egyptian embalming, usually fashioned from bronze wire about 12 to 14 inches long, hammered flat at one end and bent into a slight hook at the other. This tool accomplished one of mummification's most audacious procedures, extracting the brain through the nostril. Creating an effective brain hook required precise metallurgy. The wire needed to be stiff enough to push through the ethmoid bone without bending, yet not so rigid it would snap under stress. Bronze's advantage over pure copper, which Egyptians also had, was its superior strength. Alloyed with tin, bronze could be work hardened through hammering to increase rigidity. The hook's angle was critical, approximately 30 to 40 degrees from the shaft's axis. Too sharp an angle and it couldn't penetrate the nostril passage. Too shallow and it couldn't effectively scramble brain tissue. Archaeological examples of brain hooks show remarkable consistency in this angle, suggesting standardized training or manufacture. Modern neurosurgeons examining brain hooks note that the implement's design is actually quite sophisticated. The slight bend allows the operator to hook and twist brain tissue while maintaining a straight insertion angle through the nose. The flat handle section provides precise rotational control. The embalmer could feel exactly how much the instrument was turning, preventing over-rotation that might break the tool inside the skull. Dr. Roger Bond, a neurosurgeon who collaborated with Egyptologists to understand brain removal techniques, attempted the procedure on cadavers using replica bronze hooks. His conclusion: It's more difficult than modern nasal surgery because you can't see what you're doing. But with practice, the technique is entirely feasible. The brain hook's design is actually brilliant. It does exactly what it needs to do with minimal tissue trauma outside the target area. The flint knife used for evisceration represents technological conservatism. By the New Kingdom, Egyptians had excellent bronze metallurgy and could certainly have made bronze scalpels for the abdominal incision. But tradition demanded stone blades for the initial cut, specifically flint blades made by knapping techniques that dated to prehistoric times. Why this conservatism? Religious reasoning. Stone tools were used in mythological times when gods walked the earth. By using stone rather than metal for sacred cuts, embalmers connected their work to that primordial age. The tradition was so strong that flint knapping skills, obsolete for almost every other purpose, survived specifically for embalming and religious circumcision. But flint had practical advantages too. Properly knapped flint can be sharper than steel. Obsidian surgical scalpels today achieve edges just molecules thick. A fresh flint blade could make cleaner cuts than bronze, with less tissue trauma. The disadvantage was fragility. Flint blades broke easily and dulled quickly, but for a single incision, they were ideal. Archaeological evidence of embalming flints shows they were often ceremonially broken after use, deliberately snapped and buried with the mummification debris. This served both practical purposes, preventing reuse that might transfer spiritual pollution, and religious ones, destroying the implement that had violated the body's sacred integrity. Bronze knives and blades complemented the flint knife for subsequent cutting. Once the initial incision was made, embalmers switched to bronze implements for cutting organs free from connective tissue, trimming damaged tissue, and performing other cutting operations. These bronze knives varied in size from small scalpel-like blades 2 inches long to larger knives approaching the size of modern chef's knives. The metal was typically about 10% tin bronze, providing a good balance of hardness and ductility, resistance to breaking. Maintaining edges on bronze blades required constant attention. Bronze is softer than steel, dulling quickly. Embalmers kept whetstones nearby, frequently sharpening blades during procedures. Some workshops had specialists whose job was exclusively tool maintenance, sharpening, cleaning, and ensuring all implements were ready for use. Interestingly, chemical analysis of bronze tools from embalming workshops shows traces of fats, resins, and human tissue even after 3 millennia. Modern forensic techniques can identify these residues, confirming the tools were actually used for mummification and weren't just ceremonial objects. Spatulas and paddles made from wood, bronze, or ivory served multiple purposes. Wide, flat spatulas helped pack natron around bodies, ensuring even coverage. Smaller, narrow spatulas were used for applying oils and resins to specific areas. Some spatulas had rounded edges for manipulating dried tissue during restoration without tearing it. The material choice for spatulas depended on their use. Wood spatulas, typically made from imported cedar or local sycamore, were used for tasks where slight flexibility was beneficial, packing natron, spreading soft materials. Bronze spatulas were used where rigidity was important, holding tissue in position while cutting, applying firm pressure. Ivory spatulas, expensive and rare, were used for facial work where the material's smoothness prevented snagging on delicate dried skin. Forceps and tweezers, usually bronze, allowed embalmers to grasp and manipulate small objects and tissue pieces. Removing bone fragments from the skull after brain extraction required fine forceps that could fit through the nostril. Placing small amulets between wrapping layers required tweezers with precise grip. Bronze forceps from embalming workshops show sophisticated designs with spring mechanisms. 2 pieces of bronze were shaped identically, then joined at a pivot point with a rivet. The natural springiness of the metal made the forceps self-opening. Pressure closed them for gripping. This design, mechanically identical to modern forceps, represents impressive engineering with limited materials. Hooks of various sizes, separate from the specialized brain hook, were used throughout mummification. Large hooks helped turn and position bodies on embalming tables. Medium hooks pulled organs out through the evisceration incision. Small hooks manipulated linen strips during wrapping. These hooks were usually simple curved bronze rods, but their curves were carefully designed. A hook with too sharp a curve would tear tissue. Too gentle a curve wouldn't grip effectively. Archaeological examples show that hook curvature varied by size in consistent ratios, suggesting mathematical relationships in their design. Containers of various materials held the substances used in mummification. Large pottery jars stored natron. Smaller ceramic or bronze vessels held oils and resins. Stone jars, typically alabaster or limestone, contained precious substances like myrrh and frankincense. The container choice mattered chemically. Pottery's slight porosity could absorb oils, wasting expensive materials. Bronze containers could react with acidic substances, contaminating them. Stone containers were chemically inert, making them ideal for storing reactive materials, but they were expensive and heavy. Evidence suggests workshops maintained large inventories of various containers. Packing lists from temple embalming workshops mention hundreds of jars and vessels, indicating the scale of operations. Some containers were recycled after use. Others were ritually buried with mummification waste. Embalming tables themselves were specialized tools. The classic lion-headed table, made from expensive cedar wood, carved with protective spells, fitted with drainage channels, was a significant investment representing decades of use. The table's slight tilt, typically about 3 to 5 degrees, directed fluids toward drainage channels. The channels led to collection basins where fluids could be gathered for ritual burial. The height, approximately 30 inches, allowed embalmers to work comfortably while standing, preventing the back problems that would result from bending over for hours. Some tables had smooth surfaces. Others had slightly textured surfaces that prevented bodies from slipping. The lion head decoration wasn't merely artistic, it invoked Sekhmet's protective power over the body. Advanced tables included bronze fittings, hooks for hanging tools, rings for attaching ropes to secure bodies in position, and even primitive clamps for holding limbs steady during procedures. These refinements distinguished expensive professional tables from cheaper workshop versions. Measuring implements ensured consistency. Length measurements using cubit rods, standardized to approximately 20.6 inches, allowed embalmers to cut linen strips to uniform widths and lengths. Weight measurements, using balance scales with stone weights, ensured proper quantities of materials were used. The precision of Egyptian measurements is remarkable. Linen strips from different workshops, different time periods, and different regions of Egypt show consistent widths. One finger, about 0.7 inches, two fingers, 1.4 inches, palm width, 3 inches, and so on. This standardization indicates either centralized training, written specifications, or strong craft guild traditions that maintained uniformity. Lighting was a tool often overlooked, but critically important. Lamps burning oil or animal fat provided illumination in windowless workshop chambers. The quality of light affected the quality of work embalmers needed to see clearly to perform delicate procedures. Some workshops had polished copper or bronze mirrors positioned to reflect sunlight deep into workspace interiors. Others used multiple lamps positioned at different angles to eliminate shadows. The attention to lighting reveals how seriously embalmers took their work's visual aspects. Textiles used in wrapping were tools in their own right. Linen wasn't just cloth. It was a specialized material with specific weaves, thread counts, and widths optimized for mummification. Some linen was deliberately woven in long, narrow strips perfect for spiral wrapping. Other linen was woven in large sheets for shrouding. The finest linen approaching thread counts of 500 per inch required specialized high-count looms and expert weavers. This linen was so valuable that it was reserved for outermost wrappings and shrouds, where its quality would be visible. Interior wrappings used coarser, less expensive grades. Tool maintenance was a crucial aspect of embalming work. Bronze tools oxidized, formed greenish copper carbonate patinas, requiring regular cleaning with abrasive pastes. Cutting edges needed frequent sharpening. Wooden components needed oil treatments to prevent drying and cracking. Some workshops had dedicated tool maintenance days. All implements were cleaned, inspected, sharpened, and treated. Damaged tools were repaired or replaced. This maintenance wasn't just practical. It was religious. Properly maintained tools honored the gods and showed respect for the sacred work. Tool consecration occurred before use. New tools underwent religious rituals that dedicated them to Anubis and purified them for working on the dead. Some tools had spells inscribed on them, protective formulas, or dedications to specific deities. When embalmers retired or died, their personal tool sets were either passed to apprentices, maintaining the professional lineage, or buried with them. Archaeological finds include embalmer burials with complete tool sets, allowing modern study of actual implements used in mummification. The question posed at this chapter's beginning, could bronze tools perform surgical procedures, is answered definitively yes. Modern replications using authentic materials and techniques confirm that bronze implements, properly designed and skillfully used, could accomplish everything Egyptian embalmers needed. Bronze's supposed inadequacies, softness compared to steel, quick dulling, weren't significant limitations in practice. Embalmers didn't need tools that stayed sharp for hours. They needed tools sharp enough for specific procedures and were willing to resharpen frequently. Bronze provided that adequately. Moreover, bronze had advantages. It was easier to shape and repair than steel, requiring lower temperatures for forging. It resisted corrosion better than iron in Egypt's dry climate, and it had religious associations with divine craftsmanship that iron lacked. The tools of Egyptian embalming represent a mature technology refined over millennia, adapted to specific tasks, manufactured to consistent standards. They weren't primitive implements, but specialized instruments designed for particular purposes. In capable hands, they accomplish procedures that still impress modern medical professionals with their audacity and effectiveness. These tools, combined with the knowledge of how to use them, form the practical foundation of mummification. Without proper implements, no amount of religious ritual or expensive materials could succeed. The embalmers knew this, which is why they maintained their tools with such care, and why those tools became symbols of their profession, emblems of the craft that could transform death into immortality through skill, knowledge, and the proper application of bronze to flesh. Chapter 9. Royal Mummies. Did pharaohs receive different treatment than commoners? When the living god king of Egypt died, did embalmers employ secret techniques and rare materials unavailable to common people? Or was the fundamental process the same regardless of social status? The answer reveals both the democratic and hierarchical aspects of ancient Egyptian society. Royal mummifications followed the same basic procedures as commoner burials, evisceration, desiccation, wrapping because the religious requirements were identical. Pharaohs and peasants both needed preserved bodies to reunite with their souls. Both faced the same afterlife judgment. Both required the opening of the mouth ceremony. In this fundamental sense, death was the great equalizer. But the quality, scale, and elaboration of royal mummification far exceeded anything commoners experienced. The differences weren't in technique, but in materials, time invested, number of specialists involved, and accompanying burial equipment. Royal mummifications used the absolute finest materials available: pure natron from the best deposits, imported Lebanese cedar resin rather than local tree saps, frankincense and myrrh in lavish quantities, the finest linen with thread counts approaching 500 per inch, solid gold amulets rather than cheap faience copies. The economic scale was staggering. A pharaoh's mummification might consume resources equivalent to the entire annual income of a small town. The linen alone could cost more than most families earned in generations. The resins and aromatics might be imported from Africa, Arabia, and the Levant at enormous expense. Time investment also differed dramatically. While commoners received the standard 70-day process, royal mummification sometimes extended to 80 or 90 days. The extra time allowed for additional natron treatments, more elaborate wrapping patterns, and extended religious ceremonies. Multiple specialist embalmers worked on royal bodies simultaneously. One expert focused exclusively on the face, another on the hands, others on various body regions. This specialization allowed for refined work impossible when a single embalmer handled an entire body. Royal wrappings could incorporate hundreds of amulets rather than the dozens common mummies received. Some pharaohs had major protective amulets placed not just between wrapping layers, but also inside the body cavity, embedded in the preserved organs, or even attached to bones. The most elaborate royal treatment was reserved for the face. Some pharaohs received facial masks made from solid gold, fitted directly over the wrapped head. These masks, like Tutankhamun's famous golden funerary mask, weren't just decorative but religious, transforming the deceased into the god Osiris. Yet, interestingly, this elaborate treatment sometimes backfired. Tutankhamun's mummy shows that excessive resin application, meant to provide maximum protection, actually caused tissue carbonization. The body essentially turned into charcoal, fusing to the coffin and making later archaeological examination extremely difficult. This demonstrates a principle: more wasn't always better. The most successfully preserved mummies often came from the middle economic tier, wealthy enough for quality materials and skilled embalmers, but not so wealthy that excessive treatment caused damage. Royal burial chambers contained treasures beyond commoners' wildest dreams: golden furniture, chariots, thousands of shabty servants, complete wardrobes, jewelry, weapons, food supplies to feed an army. Tutankhamun's relatively modest tomb contained over 5,000 objects. Major pharaohs likely had far more, all now lost to ancient robbers. These treasures, ironically, made royal tombs prime targets for robbery. Almost every pharaoh's tomb was violated, usually within decades or centuries of burial. The treasures meant to support the pharaoh in eternity attracted thieves who destroyed the very immortality the treasures were meant to ensure. Commoner tombs, having little worth stealing, often survived intact simply because robbers ignored them. In a strange twist of fate, poor mummies sometimes survived better than rich ones, a reversal of their earthly fortunes. Chapter 10. The Eternal Legacy. What modern science learns from ancient mummies. What secrets do 3,000-year-old preserved bodies reveal to modern scientists armed with technology the ancient Egyptians couldn't have imagined? In research facilities worldwide, Egyptian mummies undergo examination by CT scanners, DNA sequencers, mass spectrometers, and electron microscopes. These investigations reveal information that transforms our understanding of ancient Egypt and of mummification itself. DNA analysis of mummies has revolutionized our understanding of Egyptian genetics, health, and family relationships. The famous royal mummies of the 18th dynasty have been subjected to genetic testing that confirmed family relationships, identified genetic diseases, and traced lineages with precision impossible through historical texts alone. One stunning discovery: King Tutankhamun suffered from multiple genetic disorders resulting from inbreeding among royal families. DNA analysis revealed his parents were siblings, his father was Akhenaten, his mother was Akhenaten's sister. The genetic consequences included a cleft palate, club foot, and weakened immune system that likely contributed to his death at age 19. Isotope analysis of mummy tissue reveals diet and geographic origin. Different regions have distinct isotopic signatures in their water and food. By analyzing isotopes in mummy bones and teeth, scientists can determine where someone lived at different life stages. This technique revealed that some Egyptian mummies actually came from other regions, migrating to Egypt during their lives. It showed dietary differences between social classes. Elites ate more meat and imported foods. Commoners ate more bread and beer. It even identified seasonal dietary patterns and times of famine. Pathology studies using CT scans and tissue analysis reveal disease prevalence in ancient Egypt. Mummies show evidence of arthritis, tuberculosis, parasitic infections, dental diseases, cancer, cardiovascular disease, and numerous other conditions. Some diseases that modern medicine considers recent appeared in ancient populations, challenging assumptions about disease history. One particularly significant finding: atherosclerosis, artery hardening, appeared frequently in mummies, suggesting cardiovascular disease isn't just a modern lifestyle problem, but affected ancient people too. This discovery challenged the assumption that heart disease resulted primarily from modern diets and sedentary lifestyles. Chemical analysis reveals the exact substances embalmers used. Modern analytical chemistry can identify specific plant resins, oils, and aromatics down to individual molecular compounds. This confirms ancient texts' accuracy and reveals details those texts didn't mention. For example, analysis detected beeswax mixed with resins, a detail no ancient text explicitly mentioned. It identified specific pine species used for resins, allowing researchers to trace ancient trade routes. It found antibacterial compounds that help explain why mummification succeeded at preventing decay. Forensic reconstruction using skull structure and tissue depth measurements allows creation of facial approximations showing what ancient Egyptians actually looked like. These reconstructions, combining art and science, bring individual mummies to life transforming abstract ancient Egyptians into specific human faces. The most famous reconstruction involved Tutankhamun. Based on CT scans of his skull, forensic artists created a facial approximation showing a young man with slightly protruding teeth, an elongated skull shape, and features distinctly different from his idealized artistic portraits. For the first time in 3,300 years, we could see the boy king's actual face. Religious practices become clearer through mummy studies. Examination of amulet placement, wrapping patterns, and ritual damage reveals how religious beliefs translated into practice. Variations across time periods and regions show how religious practices evolved. Perhaps most remarkably, mummy studies reveal information about mummification techniques that ancient texts never recorded. CT scans show internal packing materials, reveal repair techniques for damaged bodies, demonstrate how embalmers dealt with unusual challenges. This practical knowledge, never written down but transmitted through apprenticeship, is now being recovered through scientific examination 3 millennia after the last embalmers died. The legacy of Egyptian mummification extends beyond academic research. Modern embalming borrowed from Egyptian techniques the idea of replacing body fluids with preservative chemicals, the importance of treating bodies with dignity, the use of cosmetics to restore natural appearance. While modern methods use different chemistry, the fundamental concept connects to ancient Egypt. Medical science gained from studying mummification. The ancient Egyptians' understanding that desiccation prevents decay, that certain aromatics inhibit bacteria, and that layered protection provides long-term preservation all influenced later medical developments. Some modern surgical techniques, particularly in nasal surgery, acknowledge debt to Egyptian innovations. Museum conservation of all kinds of organic materials benefits from understanding Egyptian preservation chemistry. The same principles that preserved human bodies' desiccation, pH control, antimicrobial substances apply to preserving paper, leather, wood, and other vulnerable materials. The ultimate question remains: did Egyptian mummification achieve its goal? The religious answer, did it grant eternal life to souls in paradise, cannot be tested scientifically. But the practical answer is unambiguous. Yes, it worked spectacularly. Bodies preserved 3,000 years ago remain stable today. Tissue that should have decayed within days or weeks after death persists through millennia. The ancient Egyptians created a preservation technology so effective that modern science, with all its sophistication, struggles to match its longevity. In museums worldwide, Egyptian mummies lie as bridges between ancient and modern, dead yet preserved, gone yet present. They are humanity's longest-lasting artifacts, not objects made by humans, but humans themselves, transformed into artifacts through the sacred art of mummification. The embalmers who developed these techniques over centuries of trial and refinement could not have imagined that their work would be studied by people from civilizations yet unborn, using technologies that would seem like magic. But they understood their work's importance, preserving not just bodies, but identities, memories, and the essence of individual humans against the destructive force of time. In that mission, they succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. The mummies they created have outlasted the civilization that produced them, survived conquest and conversions, endured neglect and mishandling, and now serve as primary source material for understanding one of history's greatest civilizations. Egyptian mummification represents humanity's most successful attempt to defeat decay and, in doing so, to defeat death itself. While the religious promises of eternal paradise remain unverifiable, the physical achievement is undeniable. Human bodies made practically immortal, preserved across time spans that dwarf individual human lifetimes, standing as testimony to the skill, knowledge, and determination of the ancient embalmers who transformed death into eternal presence. The 70-day transformation from corpse to mummy, the careful application of natron and resins, the precise wrapping in hundreds of feet of linen, the elaborate rituals and prayers all combine to create what may be humanity's most enduring art form, the preservation of ourselves as physical beings for eternity. And in every museum that houses Egyptian mummies, in every scientific paper analyzing their composition, in every visitor who gazes in wonder at preserved faces from antiquity, the ancient embalmers' work continues. Not in the paradise they believed in, perhaps, but in a different kind of immortality, permanent presence in human memory and consciousness, forever fascinating, forever teaching, forever reminding us that we too will die, and that humans have always sought ways to transcend that mortality. The Egyptians found their way, the mummies prove it worked. Epilogue: The Last Embalmer. Somewhere in the declining years of the 4th century CE, perhaps in Alexandria or Memphis, the last Egyptian embalmer set down his bronze hook for the final time. 3,000 years of accumulated knowledge, refined techniques, and sacred practices ended not with dramatic finality, but with gradual abandonment, as Christianity replaced ancient beliefs and mummification became associated with pagan practices. The workshops fell silent. The recipes for preservation compounds were lost. The prayers to Anubis went unspoken. The art that had transformed death into immortality for countless generations simply stopped. But the mummies remained, and remain still. Silent witnesses to human mortality and human ingenuity, preserved bodies housing nothing yet, meaning everything, they stand as monuments to civilization's eternal project, the refusal to accept death's finality. Every museum visitor who pauses before a mummy case, every researcher who studies preserved tissue, every student who learns about ancient Egypt all participate in a different kind of afterlife than the Egyptians imagined, but perhaps one they would recognize. Memory perpetuated across millennia, presence maintained despite mortality, influence extending far beyond individual lifespan. The embalmers preserved bodies. In doing so, they preserved their civilization, making it vividly present to us in ways purely archaeological remains never could. Through their art, we don't just study ancient Egypt. We meet ancient Egyptians, face to face, across the centuries. And so the work continues, the transformation from death to immortality, not through religious ritual now, but through scientific study and historical understanding. The mummies speak to us still, teaching, revealing, amazing, fulfilling purposes their creators never imagined, but would surely appreciate. The last embalmer is long dead, but his work lives on, preserved as successfully as the bodies he prepared for eternity.